The recorded Philippine history begins on April 21st AD 900, as established by the Laguna Copperplate Inscription, LCI, discovered in 1989 along the shores of Lumban, Laguna. This copperplate is the earliest known written document originating from the Philippine archipelago. It is inscribed in Old Malay, using the Kawi script, with linguistic elements drawn from Javanese and Sanskrit, indicating cultural and political connections with neighboring Southeast Asian polities. The inscription records the clearing of a debt of a person named Namorin, detailing the pardon of his obligation by the local authorities. The significance of the Laguna Copperplate inscription lies in its clear demonstration that by the turn of the first millennium, the Philippine Islands were not isolated or disconnected. They possessed organized political structures, written language systems, legal procedures, and connections to broader regional trade networks. The document mentions the names of leaders, titles, and place names, providing evidence of recognized governance structures. For instance, references to the chief of Tundan and the authorities of Pila and Puliran indicate that multiple polities existed across Luzon, with their own jurisdictions and social hierarchies. The content of the LCI also shows that the pre-colonial inhabitants of the archipelago engaged in regional commerce and had developed diplomatic protocols for managing debt and social obligations. The use of Old Malay, a lingua franca of maritime Southeast Asia, demonstrates that the islands participated in inter-island and international communication. This aligns with archaeological and historical evidence suggesting that the Philippines, by the 9th century, had active trade relations with the Srivijaya Empire in Sumatra, Java, and the Malay Peninsula. Such interactions facilitated the exchange of goods, ideas, and technology, creating a networked environment across maritime Southeast Asia. The Laguna Copperplate inscription provides the first recorded date in Philippine history, yet it is also a window into a larger system of pre-colonial social and political organization. The mention of debts and pardons implies the existence of codified social obligations, legal recognition of property and social status, and hierarchical leadership roles. Titles such as Datu and Lakan appear in later historical records, indicating a continuity of leadership terminology. The formalization of agreements, as shown in the inscription, suggests that governance and social order were complex and structured rather than informal or primitive. The inscription's discovery in Laguna is consistent with broader archaeological findings that identify early settlements along rivers, lakes, and coastal areas. Settlements were strategically located to facilitate trade, agriculture, and communication. Artifacts found in the region, including ceramics imported from China and other parts of Southeast Asia, confirm that pre-colonial communities engaged in commerce beyond the islands. These communities were likely composed of social strata, including elites, commoners, and specialized classes involved in trade, craft, and governance. The LCI also demonstrates the influence of regional Southeast Asian culture on the Philippines during this period. The use of Sanskrit loanwords and Old Malay terminology reflects the broader Indianized kingdoms of maritime Southeast Asia, which introduced administrative, religious, and cultural models across the region. These influences shaped local systems of governance, ritual, and law, blending with indigenous traditions to form distinctive Filipino polities. Early Philippine communities adopted maritime navigation, agricultural practices, and social institutions that allowed them to engage in both local and long-distance trade. From a historical perspective, The year AD 900 serves as a clear starting point for recorded history because it is verifiable through archaeological and epigraphic evidence. Unlike oral histories or legendary accounts, the LCI provides a fixed date, names, locations, and legal context, offering a tangible reference for historians. It marks the transition from prehistory, based on material culture and oral tradition, to a period in which events, leaders, and agreements were documented in writing. The Laguna Copperplate inscription also offers insights into societal values, particularly regarding governance, justice, and economic responsibility. The record of debt forgiveness indicates that the community had mechanisms for social reconciliation and legal enforcement. Authority figures exercised administrative oversight, ensuring that obligations were managed in accordance with accepted norms. Such practices reveal a society that valued order, accountability, and structured interaction between leaders and subjects. Furthermore, the LCI shows evidence of cultural connectivity, demonstrating that the early Philippines was integrated into the maritime trade system of Southeast Asia. Merchants, travelers, and diplomats likely moved between islands and mainland polities, bringing ideas, technologies, and religious concepts. These interactions contributed to the development of complex societies, urban centers, and trade hubs that would later become important during the pre-colonial period, leading up to the arrival of European explorers. In conclusion, the Laguna Copperplate inscription of April 21st, AD 900 provides the earliest recorded evidence of Philippine civilization. It confirms that the archipelago had organized polities, legal systems, and participation in regional networks. This date marks the beginning of a documented historical trajectory that continues through centuries of social, political, and economic evolution. The inscription is the foundation upon which the subsequent history of the Philippines is built, connecting early societies to the broader patterns of Southeast Asian development and establishing a continuous historical narrative that can be traced to the modern era. By understanding the context, content, and implications of the LCI, historians can anchor Philippine history within a broader regional framework, observing both the uniqueness of local development and its integration into Southeast Asian maritime networks. The recognition of AD 900 as the starting point of recorded history allows for a structured approach to documenting the Philippines' political, cultural, and economic evolution over the following millennium. Between the 9th and 16th centuries, the Philippine archipelago consisted of multiple independent polities, each organized around a barangay, the basic political unit. Barangays were led by local chiefs called datus, who exercised authority over small communities, usually consisting of a few hundred to several thousand people. Some barangays were grouped under the leadership of a higher-ranking leader, sometimes referred to as a lakan or raja, particularly in regions with significant trade and interaction with foreign powers. These polities maintained autonomous governance, but interbarangay alliances, trade agreements, and occasional conflicts shaped regional political landscapes. The settlements were typically located along rivers, coastlines, and fertile plains, which allowed access to agriculture, fishing, and trade. Archaeological evidence indicates that rice cultivation, root crops, and horticulture were central to subsistence. Domestic animals, including pigs and chickens, were raised for food and craft production, such as weaving, pottery, and metalworking, was present in many communities. Tools made of iron and bronze, as well as jewelry and ornaments, have been recovered from sites in Butuan, Cebu, and Tonda, confirming a degree of material culture sophistication. Trade played a crucial role in the development of these polities. Between AD 900 and 1521, the Philippines was part of a regional maritime network that extended to China, the Malay Peninsula, Sumatra, Java, Borneo, and India. Evidence from shipwrecks, ceramics, and other artifacts shows sustained interaction with the Song 960 to 1279 and Ming 1368 to 1644 dynasties in China. Chinese porcelain, celadon, and other ceramics have been found in archaeological sites such as Butuan and Bolinao, while Indian beads, glassware, and metal objects suggest trade links with South Asia. The presence of these goods reflects both the importation of foreign materials and local elites' participation in exchange networks, allowing for the acquisition of prestige items and the reinforcement of social hierarchies. Important pre-colonial centers included Tonda, situated in the Pasig River Delta near present-day Manila, Butuan, located in northeastern Mindanao, Cebu, a key Visayan settlement, and Sulu, which became the center of the Sultanate of Sulu in the 15th century. Tonda was recognized for its centralized governance and its role in regional trade. By the 10th century, developed advanced maritime capabilities, constructing large barangay boats, which facilitated inter-island transport and international commerce. These vessels, made of hardwood planks joined by intricate dowels and pegs, could carry substantial cargo, including gold, resin, and other trade goods. Archaeological findings in Butuan, including burial goods and gold ornaments, indicate a complex society with hierarchical structures and specialized labor. The Visayas, including Cebu, Panay, and Leyte, were strategically located along the maritime routes connecting Mindoro and Mindanao. Cebu, particularly, engaged in trade with Chinese and Malay merchants and developed alliances and tributary relations with nearby polities. Sulu, in the southwestern Philippines, emerged as a maritime power by the late 14th century. Its rulers converted to Islam and established political and trade networks that connected the southern Philippines with Borneo, Malacca, and the broader Malay world. The establishment of the Sultanate of Sulu facilitated the introduction of Islamic governance, jurisprudence, and commerce into the region, influencing social organization, law, and ritual. Social hierarchy within barangays and larger polities was structured but flexible. The Datu held authority over land allocation, taxation, and conflict resolution. Below the Datu were warriors and skilled artisans, as well as commoners who farmed land or engaged in fishing. Slavery existed in some form, with alipins serving under households or in tribute arrangements. However, slavery was not widespread and was usually incorporated into kinship networks or political patronage. Marriage alliances, kinship ties, and trade agreements often determined relations between barangays and larger political units. Political organization was reinforced through diplomatic relations. Pre-colonial polities occasionally formed alliances or engaged in warfare over resources, trade access, or territorial disputes. Tributes were paid between polities to acknowledge authority or maintain peace. Chinese records from the Song dynasty refer to the polity of Mai, located in present-day Mindoro, and the polity of Pahuang, in northern Palawan. indicating that Chinese envoys and merchants had documented these polities as trading partners. These records illustrate that the Philippines was integrated into the regional economy well before European contact. Religious practices during this period also reflected regional interaction. Indigenous belief systems were predominantly animist, emphasizing reverence for spirits, ancestors, and natural phenomena. Deities associated with the sea, mountains, rivers, and forests were venerated through rituals conducted by Babalians or priestesses, who mediated between communities and spiritual forces. By the late 14th century, Islam was introduced into Sulu and Mindanao, integrating the southern islands into the broader Islamic maritime network. Muslim leaders, or sultans, established governance structures that combined Islamic law with local customs. The spread of Islam also facilitated trade connections with Muslim merchants from Southeast Asia and beyond, contributing to the consolidation of political and economic influence in Mindanao and the Sulu archipelago. Material evidence supports the complexity of pre-colonial society. Sites in Butuan, Tonda, Cebu, and other centers reveal the use of metal tools, gold jewelry, pottery, and Chinese ceramics. Burial practices indicate social stratification, with elite graves containing imported goods, suggesting participation in regional trade networks and access to foreign luxury items. The discovery of barangay boats in Butuan provides evidence of seafaring technology and organized maritime logistics, confirming that inter-island travel and commerce were integral to political and economic life. The regional trade network was not limited to Southeast Asia. Items from China, India, and possibly the Middle East reached the Philippines via intermediary ports in the Malay Peninsula and Indonesia. This network enabled the exchange of goods, technologies, and ideas, influencing political organization, social structure, and material culture. Local leaders leveraged these connections to enhance their political legitimacy and secure resources for their communities. Trade also facilitated the spread of new crops, technologies, and cultural practices, contributing to agricultural, technological, and social development across the archipelago. The continuity of these polities from AD 900 to the early 16th century reflects both adaptation and resilience. The integration of indigenous governance with external influences produced hybrid systems of law, trade, and political authority. While each barangay maintained local autonomy, the interconnectivity among settlements allowed for coordinated responses to threats, economic opportunities, and cultural exchange. Leaders negotiated alliances, participated in regional trade, and managed social hierarchies that balanced local authority with broader diplomatic networks. By the 15th and early 16th centuries, pre-colonial polities were highly organized and capable of sustaining complex trade and governance structures. They had established permanent settlements, hierarchical social systems, maritime capabilities, and trade networks that connected them to wider Southeast Asia. These polities formed the foundation for subsequent interactions with European explorers, setting the stage for Spanish colonization after Ferdinand Magellan arrived in 1521. The period between the 9th and early 16th centuries in the Philippine archipelago was characterized not only by the establishment of barangays and regional polities, but also by the development of complex religious and cultural systems. Pre-colonial societies maintained belief systems that were primarily animist, combined with ancestor worship and the influence of Hindu-Buddhist traditions introduced through trade and cultural exchanges across maritime Southeast Asia. These systems were complemented in the southern regions by the gradual introduction and establishment of Islam beginning in the late 14th century, which created the foundations for the sultanates of Sulu and Maguindanao. Animism in pre-colonial Philippine societies involved the belief that natural objects, such as rivers, mountains, trees, and seas, were inhabited by spirits or supernatural forces. Communities assigned roles to Babayans, often women, who functioned as religious leaders, healers, and mediators between the spiritual and human worlds. Babylonians conducted rituals to ensure successful harvests, safe voyages, and social harmony. Ritual practices included offerings, prayers, and dances that symbolized connections to ancestral and environmental spirits. The societal position of Babayans reflected the respect given to spiritual authority and their critical function in maintaining both social and ecological balance. Ancestor worship was a central feature of pre-colonial Philippine belief systems. Families maintained altars in their homes or in designated sacred spaces to honor deceased members, seeking guidance and protection. Burial practices varied across regions, but archaeological evidence indicates the use of jars, coffins, and grave goods, including ornaments, beads, and ceramics, often imported from China and Southeast Asia. Elite burials contained higher value objects, signaling social stratification and the incorporation of trade goods into spiritual practices. The inclusion of foreign items in burials demonstrates the interaction between local belief systems and broader maritime trade networks. Influences from Hinduism and Buddhism arrived in the Philippines through contact with Indianized kingdoms in maritime Southeast Asia, particularly the Srivijaya Empire in Sumatra and the Majapahit Empire in Java. These influences were primarily visible in art, political concepts, titles, and social organization rather than in organized religious institutions. Sanskrit loanwords appear in inscriptions and local languages, and some political titles, such as Raja, were borrowed from Indianized polities. Iconography and motifs reflecting Hindu-Buddhist cosmology have been found in artifacts such as bronze figurines, jewelry, and pottery, suggesting an elite cultural adoption of foreign ideas, while local practices remained distinct. By the late 14th century, Islam began to establish a presence in the southern Philippines. Muslim traders and missionaries arrived from Borneo, Malacca, and other parts of Southeast Asia, introducing Islamic law, governance structures, and religious practices. The Sultanate of Sulu was founded in 1457 by Sharif ul-Hashim, a Muslim missionary and political leader. The Sultanate implemented a legal code based on Sharia principles, combined with local customary law, and developed diplomatic and trade relations with neighboring polities. The Sultanate became a political and economic center in the Sulu archipelago, controlling maritime routes between Mindanao, Borneo, and the rest of the Malay world. The Sultanate of Maguindanao emerged later in central Mindanao. Established by Sharif Kabungsawan in the early 16th century, the Sultanate expanded the influence of Islam in Mindanao through political alliances, trade, and religious propagation. Islam provided both a unifying ideological framework and an administrative system that allowed leaders to consolidate authority over multiple communities. The southern sultanates maintained trade networks with other Muslim states in Southeast Asia, including Malacca and Brunei, importing goods and exporting local products such as pearls, gold, and forest resources. Cultural practices in the pre-colonial Philippines reflected a synthesis of indigenous, Hindu-Buddhist, and Islamic elements. For example, social hierarchy was articulated both through local customs and through imported concepts of kingship and nobility. The use of titles such as Datu, Raja, and Sultan indicated political authority and was often associated with control over land, trade, and military power. Communities engaged in various forms of labor specialization, including farming, weaving, metalworking, and seafaring, reflecting economic organization alongside cultural and religious systems. Art and material culture illustrate these overlapping influences. Local communities produced pottery, metalwork, textiles, and jewelry for daily use, trade, and ceremonial purposes. Imported goods, particularly Chinese porcelain, Indian beads, and Malay brass and copper items, were integrated into both elite and ritual contexts. Music, dance, and oral literature were essential aspects of cultural life. Epic poetry, legends, and chants conveyed historical memory, moral values, and genealogical knowledge, functioning as both entertainment and a means of preserving social cohesion. Trade and cultural exchange facilitated the spread of ideas and technology across the archipelago. Maritime routes allowed communities to interact with China, the Malay world, India, and later Islamic trading networks. Ships, such as the barangay, enabled the transport of people, goods, and cultural practices between islands, supporting the growth of regional centers of commerce and governance. Urban centers such as Tanda, Butuan, and Sulu became nodes of trade, diplomacy, and religious influence, reflecting a complex integration of local and foreign systems. Education in pre-colonial Philippine societies was informal and practical. Knowledge of navigation, agriculture, oral literature, craft production, and spiritual practice was transmitted within families, through apprenticeships, and through religious instruction from Babylons or Muslim teachers. Numeracy, accounting, and literacy in scripts such as Kawi or Arabic in the South were functional tools for trade, administration, and religious observance. The introduction of Islam in the southern Philippines was accompanied by the adoption of Arabic script, which facilitated record-keeping, correspondence, and the codification of laws. Islamic jurisprudence influenced governance, dispute resolution, and social conduct, creating a legal system integrated into the Sultanate's political structures. This adaptation coexisted with indigenous customary laws in Mindanao and Sulu, forming hybrid governance models that regulated daily life, property, and social obligations. Religious and cultural diversity in the archipelago shaped social interactions and trade networks. Northern and central islands remained primarily animist and Hindu-Buddhist influenced, while the southern regions increasingly adopted Islam. These differences affected political alliances, trade patterns, and military engagement. Despite diversity, shared maritime technologies, economic interdependence, and regional networks created a cohesive system of interaction across the islands. The period from AD 900 to 1521 also witnessed the rise of coastal and riverine settlements that integrated religious, political, and economic functions. Barangays along major rivers or coasts served as hubs for trade, governance, and religious observance. Leaders leveraged religious authority, including ritual expertise, to reinforce political legitimacy. Muslim sultanates used religious legitimacy to consolidate authority, while northern and central polities maintained influence through customary and ceremonial practices. By the early 16th century, these cultural and religious systems had developed into well-established frameworks that structured daily life, governance, and economic activity. The integration of indigenous practices with external influences created hybridized societies capable of sustaining trade, law, and political organization. These systems provided the foundation for interactions with European explorers and colonizers beginning with Ferdinand Magellan in 1521, setting the stage for subsequent periods of colonial rule and continued cultural evolution. The recorded interaction between the Philippine archipelago and European powers began on March 16, 1521, when the Portuguese navigator Ferdinand Magellan, sailing under the Spanish crown, landed on Hominhan Island in eastern Samar during his circumnavigation expedition. Magellan's voyage, commissioned by King Charles I of Spain, sought to establish a westward maritime route to the Spice Islands in the Moluccas and extend Spanish influence in Southeast Asia. His arrival in the Philippine Islands marked the first sustained European contact, introducing new political, economic, and cultural dynamics to the archipelago. Upon landing, Magellan and his crew encountered indigenous communities organized in barangays, each led by a datu. Initial interactions were largely peaceful and guided by negotiation and reciprocal exchanges of gifts. Magellan sought alliances with local leaders to facilitate Spanish passage and trade. In Cebu, he established relations with Raja Humabon, the local ruler, who commanded multiple barangays and held significant influence over the surrounding region. Humabon agreed to a formal alliance with the Spanish, accepting baptism into Christianity and providing access to resources and manpower. The introduction of Christianity, initially limited to a symbolic conversion of Humabon and his household, represented the first religious engagement between European Catholicism and the indigenous spiritual system. While the broader population remained adherent to animist, Hindu-Buddhist, or Islamic practices, these early conversions signaled the beginning of religious change that would later intensify under Spanish colonization. Missionary efforts during this period were exploratory and incidental rather than institutionalized, but they provided the foundation for subsequent Catholic missions in the archipelago. Trade and diplomacy were central to Magellan's initial interactions. The Spanish expedition engaged in the exchange of goods with local communities, including textiles, foodstuffs, and metal tools. Indigenous leaders were motivated by the prospect of acquiring European items, which conferred prestige and enhanced political authority. These exchanges, however, were accompanied by strategic assessments by both parties, as local leaders evaluated the potential threats and benefits of foreign alliances. The ability of barangay leaders to negotiate, grant privileges, or resist foreign demands reflected the pre-existing political sophistication of the archipelago. On April 27, 1521, Magellan was killed in the Battle of Mactan, near the present-day island of Cebu, during a military confrontation with forces led by Lapu-Lapu, the local datu of Mactan. Lapu-Lapu resisted Spanish attempts to assert control over his territory, opposing the imposition of external authority. The battle was initiated when Magellan attempted to compel Lapu-Lapu to submit to Humabon's authority and accept Spanish influence. Indigenous forces employed knowledge of the local geography, coastal fortifications, and organized resistance tactics, resulting in the death of Magellan and several crew members. The conflict demonstrated the capacity of local leaders to mobilize armed resistance against foreign incursions and to maintain political autonomy in the face of external threats. The aftermath of the Battle of Mactan had immediate and long-term implications. Magellan's death temporarily disrupted Spanish plans for conquest and delayed further European engagement in the archipelago. The expedition continued under the command of Juan Sebastián Elcano, ultimately completing the circumnavigation of the globe and returning to Spain in 1522. Despite the loss of Magellan, the voyage provided detailed reports on the geography, culture, political structures, and resources of the Philippine Islands, informing subsequent Spanish expeditions and colonization efforts. The First Contact period also exposed the archipelago to European maritime technology, navigation, and military organization. Magellan's ships introduced advanced shipbuilding techniques, firearms, and metal armor to local observers. While initial military engagements were limited, indigenous communities quickly assessed the capabilities of these new technologies, adapting defensive strategies and maintaining local control over their territories. The encounter revealed a balance of technological advantage and localized tactical knowledge, which allowed pre-colonial polities to survive the initial European incursions. Diplomatic alliances established during this period were strategic rather than religiously motivated. Raja Humabon's cooperation with Magellan was influenced by the potential to expand his influence over neighboring barangays, acquire valuable trade goods, and consolidate regional power. This cooperation illustrates the complex interplay of indigenous political objectives and European imperial ambitions. Local leaders evaluated foreign presence based on potential gains, demonstrating the continuity of autonomous decision-making despite the presence of European forces. The arrival of Europeans also began the integration of the Philippines into global maritime routes. Although Magellan's expedition did not immediately establish permanent settlements, it initiated the inclusion of the archipelago in European navigational charts, which would later facilitate trade, colonization, and missionary activity. Spanish accounts of the islands described natural resources, political structures, and potential for conversion, contributing to subsequent planning for sustained Spanish presence. Indigenous societies observed these foreign activities, assessed risks, and adjusted alliances and defense strategies accordingly. Magellan's voyage was part of broader patterns of European exploration during the early 16th century. Spain and Portugal were engaged in a competitive search for trade routes and territorial claims in Southeast Asia. The Philippines, situated between the South China Sea and the Moluccas, represented a strategic point for maritime navigation and potential access to the spice trade. European engagement in the archipelago was therefore motivated by both economic and geopolitical considerations, with the First Contact period establishing the initial frameworks for later colonization. The historical significance of 1521 is anchored in its documentation through Spanish logs, letters, and reports. Contemporary sources, such as Antonio Pigafetta's chronicles, provide detailed observations on geography, social organization, trade, and cultural practices. These records allow historians to reconstruct events, identify leaders, and understand the dynamics of early contact without reliance on oral tradition. Archaeological evidence corroborates these accounts, with material culture from Cebu, Homenhan, and Mactan confirming the presence of pre-colonial settlement patterns and trade activity. During this period, local governance and social structures were critical in determining the outcomes of foreign interaction. Barangay leaders, including Lapu-Lapu and Humabon, exercised decision-making authority over military mobilization, diplomacy, and internal administration. Their actions reflected pre-existing political sophistication, which allowed them to negotiate, resist, or accommodate foreign influence as conditions required. This agency underscores the capacity of pre-colonial polities to maintain autonomy in the face of European exploration. In summary, the events of 1521 represent the first recorded encounter between the Philippine archipelago and European powers, characterized by exploration, diplomacy, trade, and armed conflict. Magellan's arrival, his engagement with Raja Humabon, and his death at Mactan illustrate the complex interactions between European navigators and indigenous polities. The period established initial frameworks for subsequent Spanish expeditions and colonial activity, providing detailed knowledge of the archipelago's geography, social organization, and resources. Indigenous leaders maintained political authority, demonstrating the persistence of local governance structures and the capacity to evaluate and respond to foreign influence. This mixture of contact, exchange, and conflict defined the period preceding the arrival of permanent Spanish settlement. European influence was initially limited to observation, diplomatic negotiation, and sporadic military engagement, while indigenous communities retained control over their territories. These first interactions laid the foundation for the political, economic, and religious transformations that would follow during the Spanish colonization, beginning in 1565, establishing the Philippines as a site of sustained European presence in Southeast Asia. The formal establishment of Spanish authority in the Philippine archipelago began on April 27, 1565, when Miguel López de Legazpi arrived in Cebu and founded the first permanent Spanish settlement. Legazpi's expedition was sent by the Spanish crown following the exploratory voyages of Ferdinand Magellan in 1521, and subsequent reconnaissance by Spanish navigators to secure trade routes to the Spice Islands and extend Spanish influence in the East Indies. Legazpi's arrival marked the transition from episodic European contact to organized colonial administration, initiating systematic political, religious, and economic changes across the islands. Upon arrival, Legazpi sought to establish alliances with local rulers to consolidate Spanish authority and facilitate governance. Cebu, a significant Visayan settlement, became the initial center of Spanish administration. The local leader, Raja Tupas, negotiated with Legazpi, allowing the Spanish to establish a fort and administrative base. These negotiations involved tribute arrangements and the recognition of Spanish authority, signaling the first stages of colonial governance. The Spanish strategy emphasized diplomacy with cooperative local leaders, while simultaneously using military force against those who resisted submission. In 1571, Legazpi moved the administrative center to Manila, recognizing its strategic position along Manila Bay and its access to internal trade routes via the Pasig River. Manila was formally established as the colonial capital, serving as the central hub for political administration, religious missions, and economic activity. The location provided both defensive advantages and proximity to key trading centers in Luzon and the wider archipelago. The establishment of Manila represented the consolidation of Spanish authority in northern and central Luzon, with the fortification of Intramuros beginning soon after to serve as a military administrative, and religious stronghold. Economic integration was central to the early Spanish administration. In 1565, the Manila Acapulco Galleon Trade was initiated, connecting the Philippines directly to the Spanish Empire. This trade route facilitated the exchange of Asian goods, including Chinese silk, porcelain, and spices, for silver and other commodities from the Americas. The galleon trade established Manila as a global trade hub, linking the archipelago to international economic networks and providing revenue for the colonial administration. Indigenous populations participated as laborers, boatmen, and artisans, while Spanish authorities regulated trade, collection of taxes, and shipment of goods. The Spanish conquest involved both diplomacy and military campaigns. While the Spanish established authority in Cebu and Manila, other regions, particularly Mindanao and the Cordillera Highlands, resisted submission. Military expeditions were undertaken to pacify opposition, construct forts, and secure territories along key trade routes. Spanish forces relied on alliances with compliant local rulers, augmented by soldiers and naval support, to extend influence. The establishment of forts, such as Fort San Pedro in Cebu, served as strategic points for administration, defense, and consolidation of Spanish power. Religious conversion was a central element of Spanish colonization. Catholic missionaries, primarily Augustinians, Franciscans, and Jesuits, accompanied Legazpi and subsequent expeditions, aiming to convert the local population to Christianity. Churches were constructed alongside forts and administrative centers, serving as both religious and social institutions. Missionaries learned local languages and employed methods of instruction, including catechism, religious education, and translation of texts. By establishing parishes and organizing religious communities, missionaries facilitated the integration of indigenous populations into the colonial religious framework. The Spanish administration implemented a system of governance based on both European and adapted local structures. The encomienda system was introduced, granting Spanish officials control over local labor and tribute in exchange for protection and religious instruction. Indigenous leaders were often co-opted into the administration, maintaining local authority while serving colonial objectives. Barangay leaders were recognized as intermediaries, responsible for collecting tribute and organizing labor, which allowed the Spanish to govern efficiently while minimizing confrontation with established local political structures. Urban development under Spanish rule included the construction of administrative centers, churches, and fortified settlements. The establishment of intramuros in Manila provided a controlled space for administration, defense, and religious activity. Spanish urban planning emphasized fortifications, centralized governance, and proximity to maritime access, reflecting both military and commercial priorities. Indigenous labor and resources were mobilized for construction, demonstrating the integration of local capacities into colonial projects. Military engagements with resistant groups were ongoing during this period. Indigenous communities in Mindanao, Sulu, and the Cordilleras maintained autonomy, utilizing knowledge of terrain and localized warfare strategies. The Spanish engaged in expeditions to pacify areas, often encountering resistance from Muslim communities in Mindanao and the Sulu archipelago. These conflicts marked the beginning of the Moro Wars, a centuries-long series of confrontations between Spanish forces and Islamic polities in the southern Philippines. Resistance in highland regions, such as the Cordilleras, was characterized by defensive strategies, including fortified villages and decentralized governance, which limited Spanish control and required continued negotiation and military presence. The Manila Acapulco Galleon Trade, initiated under Legazpi's administration, had profound social and economic effects. It linked local economies to global markets, introducing new commodities, currency, and trade practices. Chinese merchants became central intermediaries, supplying silk, porcelain, and other goods for export. Indigenous populations were incorporated into labor networks to support shipping, port activities, and the production of export commodities. Revenue from the galleon trade allowed the colonial administration to finance military campaigns, religious missions, and urban development. Spanish governance during 1565 to 1600 relied on the dual approach of religious conversion and political control. Catholic missionaries reinforced colonial authority by promoting loyalty to Spanish rulers and integrating local communities into parish structures. Religious conversion was paired with instruction in Spanish law, governance, and cultural norms, gradually reshaping indigenous social organization. The establishment of regularized tribute systems, land allocation policies, and municipal structures created administrative frameworks that persisted throughout the colonial period. By the end of the 16th century, Spanish rule was consolidated in Luzon and parts of the Visayas, while resistance persisted in southern and highland regions. Indigenous communities demonstrated adaptation to the presence of Spanish authorities through alliances, strategic compliance, and localized negotiation. Barangay leaders maintained roles within colonial administration, balancing obligations to the Spanish crown with the interests of their constituents. The political landscape was characterized by the coexistence of Spanish authority and autonomous indigenous governance in areas beyond immediate colonial reach. Education and literacy were initially limited to administrative and religious purposes. Missionaries and Spanish officials recorded local languages, customs, and laws, producing early dictionaries, catechisms, and chronicles. Knowledge of trade practices, governance, and religion was disseminated primarily through parishes and missionary instruction. Indigenous knowledge, including maritime navigation, agriculture, and craft production, continued to be central to local economies, even as Spanish institutions sought to standardize legal, religious, and economic systems. Cultural transformation occurred alongside the introduction of European institutions. Indigenous ceremonial practices, social hierarchies, and political alliances adapted to incorporate colonial structures. Christianity was introduced as a central organizing principle for communities, influencing festivals, rituals, and moral frameworks. Spanish legal codes and governance mechanisms were implemented incrementally, creating a hybrid administrative environment in which local leaders mediated between colonial authorities and their communities. By the close of the 16th century, Spanish authority had established permanent settlements, a functioning colonial administration, and a system of trade connecting the Philippines to the global Spanish Empire. Manila emerged as the principal political, religious, and commercial hub, while Cebu and other coastal settlements served as regional centers. Indigenous polities in the Visayas and Luzon were largely integrated into colonial structures. At the same time, Mindanao and the Sulu archipelago maintained partial autonomy, setting the stage for continued military and diplomatic engagement in the following century. The 17th century in the Philippine archipelago marked a period of consolidation for Spanish colonial rule, building upon the administrative, economic, and religious foundations established in the previous decades. By 1600, Spanish authorities had secured permanent settlements in Luzon and key parts of the Visayas, while Mindanao and Sulu remained largely outside direct control. The focus of colonial governance during this period was to strengthen administrative structures, expand missionary work, maintain trade networks, and suppress resistance from independent polities and Islamic sultanates. The expansion of Spanish missions was a central component of consolidation. Catholic religious orders, including Augustinians, Franciscans, Jesuits, and Dominicans, established parishes, convents, and schools throughout Luzon and the Visayas. Missionaries were responsible for both religious instruction and cultural integration, translating prayers, catechisms, and hymns into local languages, and incorporating pre-colonial practices where possible to facilitate acceptance. The presence of missionaries also reinforced colonial authority by creating a network of loyal administrators within communities. Religious instruction was compulsory in towns under direct Spanish control, with parish priests acting as intermediaries between local populations and colonial officials. The colonial government strengthened administrative and military structures to secure territories. Governors general were appointed to manage the colony on behalf of the Spanish crown, overseeing taxation, legal matters, and defense. Local governance relied heavily on barangay leaders, who were incorporated into the colonial system as intermediaries responsible for collecting tribute, organizing labor for public works, and ensuring compliance with Spanish regulations. Urban centers, such as Manila, Cebu, and Vigan, were developed as administrative hubs, featuring fortifications, government offices, and church complexes. Fortifications, such as Fort Santiago in Manila, were constructed and maintained to protect against both internal resistance and external threats, including raids by foreign powers and local uprisings. Spanish authorities faced ongoing resistance from indigenous and Muslim communities. In Mindanao, Sulu, and parts of the Visayas, Muslim polities resisted submission to colonial rule, defending their territories through fortified settlements and organized military campaigns. These confrontations became known collectively as the Moro Wars, which spanned several centuries. Spanish expeditions were dispatched to southern regions to secure trade routes, enforce tribute collection, and assert sovereignty, often encountering entrenched resistance. Highland communities in northern Luzon, such as the Igorot, also resisted direct Spanish control, preserving autonomous governance structures and continuing local agricultural, ritual, and social practices. Economic consolidation was reinforced by the continuation of the Manila Acapulco Galleon Trade, which linked the archipelago to the Spanish Empire. Manila served as the central port for the collection and export of goods, including silk, porcelain, and spices, in exchange for silver and European commodities. Indigenous labor supported galleon construction, port management, and goods production. Chinese merchants played a key role as intermediaries, supplying manufactured goods and luxury items for export. The galleon trade generated revenue that funded colonial administration, military campaigns, and religious missions, integrating the Philippine economy into global markets and reinforcing Spanish authority. The colonial administration also implemented legal and social structures to standardize governance. Spanish law was applied through local and regional tribunals, overseen by governors and, in some areas, by the Audiencia of Manila, a judicial body that adjudicated disputes and supervised officials. Indigenous leaders were often incorporated into these systems as principales, serving administrative roles in towns while ensuring local compliance with Spanish regulations. Land tenure, taxation, and labor obligations were formalized, with the encomienda system continuing to regulate the extraction of labor and tribute. These structures established a framework of governance that combined European legal norms with localized administration, ensuring both fiscal and political control over the majority of Luzon and the Visayas. Social transformation during this period was closely linked to religious and administrative consolidation. Catholicism became increasingly integrated into daily life through the establishment of parish structures, compulsory attendance at Mass, and participation in religious festivals. Christian rituals replaced, modified, or coexisted with pre-colonial animist and ancestor-focused practices, while the influence of Islam remained significant in southern regions. The presence of priests in towns reinforced Spanish authority, as religious instruction, moral guidance, and social oversight were intertwined with colonial governance. The 17th century also witnessed cultural and technological exchange. Spanish authorities introduced European agricultural methods, livestock, and new crops, which were incorporated into local farming systems. The construction of roads, bridges, and public buildings facilitated administrative control and economic activity. Indigenous communities contributed knowledge of local conditions, materials, and techniques, enabling the successful adaptation of European methods to the archipelago's environment. Art, language, and writing evolved under colonial influence, with Spanish becoming the language of administration while local languages persisted in everyday use. Literacy in the Latin script increased among the local elite, facilitated by missionary schools and parish instruction. Trade and diplomacy remained critical for both Spanish authorities and indigenous leaders. Coastal and riverine barangays continued to engage in inter-island trade, supplying agricultural products, forest goods, and maritime resources. Local rulers navigated a complex environment of Spanish oversight, regional alliances, and economic opportunity, leveraging trade and tribute to maintain political influence. Indigenous leadership adapted to the colonial framework, negotiating obligations and privileges while preserving local autonomy where possible. Military engagements were a constant feature of Spanish consolidation. Expeditions to southern and northern regions required coordination between colonial authorities, missionary personnel, and allied indigenous leaders. Fortifications along the coast, including Fort San Pedro in Cebu and Fort Pilar in Zamboanga, served as defensive positions and administrative centers. Naval capabilities were expanded to patrol territorial waters, secure trade routes, and respond to raids by resisting communities. Spanish forces adapted to local conditions, employing strategies that combined European military organization with knowledge of the archipelago's geography and maritime environment. By the mid-17th century, Spanish consolidation extended to the majority of Luzon and central Visayas, establishing a relatively stable colonial structure. Areas of persistent resistance, particularly in Mindanao, Sulu, and the Cordillera Highlands, maintained partial autonomy but were integrated into broader economic and diplomatic networks. The balance of authority involved negotiation, tribute arrangements, military oversight, and religious instruction, reflecting a pragmatic approach to governance in a geographically dispersed and culturally diverse archipelago. The period also solidified Manila as a global trade and administrative center. As the hub of the galleon trade, Manila facilitated the collection of tribute, coordination of military resources, and distribution of goods throughout the islands. The city became a focal point for Spanish administration, Chinese trade, and European diplomatic presence in Southeast Asia. Indigenous communities in surrounding regions contributed labor, agricultural products, and commercial services, integrating local economies into the colonial framework while maintaining elements of pre-colonial social and political organization. Religious influence continued to expand, with missionary orders establishing schools, hospitals, and churches. Catechism and literacy instruction were used to reinforce social hierarchy, political loyalty, and moral discipline. Indigenous populations were organized into reductions, centralized settlements designed to facilitate administration, taxation, and religious oversight. This settlement strategy enabled Spanish authorities to monitor communities effectively, impose tribute obligations, and implement religious instruction, while also consolidating population centers for defense and governance. By the close of the 17th century, Spanish consolidation in the Philippines had achieved significant administrative, economic, and religious integration, particularly in Luzon and the Visayas. Indigenous political structures were co-opted into the colonial system, missionary activity extended Catholic influence, and trade networks connected the archipelago to the global Spanish Empire. Resistance persisted in southern and highland regions, reflecting the limits of direct control and the continuing autonomy of local polities. The 17th century thus represents a period of structured governance, expansion of colonial infrastructure, and ongoing negotiation between Spanish authorities and indigenous communities. The 18th century in the Philippine archipelago was characterized by both internal reforms within the Spanish colonial administration and external challenges that tested the resilience of colonial authority. By 1700, Spanish governance had been consolidated in Luzon and the Visayas, with Manila functioning as the political, economic, and religious hub. Catholic missions, trade networks, and military structures were firmly established, while Mindanao, Sulu, and highland regions retained varying degrees of autonomy. This period saw attempts at economic modernization, administrative reform, and responses to geopolitical threats, reflecting the evolving strategies of the Spanish Empire in Southeast Asia. Economic reform emerged as a central objective during the late 18th century. Under the administration of Governor-General José Bosco y Vargas, 1778 to 1787, the colonial government implemented policies designed to enhance agricultural productivity, stimulate trade, and increase revenues for the Spanish crown. Bosco y Vargas promoted the cultivation of cash crops, including indigo, coffee, sugar, and tobacco, in regions suited for production. The government provided technical support and incentives to local farmers, encouraged the establishment of agricultural settlements, and sought to integrate indigenous labor into these programs. The introduction of new crops and farming techniques reflected a pragmatic approach to resource management and economic diversification within the colonial framework. Infrastructure development accompanied economic initiatives. Roads, bridges, and irrigation systems were expanded to facilitate trade, communication, and agricultural production. Ports in Manila, Cavite, and Cebu were enhanced to accommodate increased shipping activity, particularly related to the Manila Acapulco Galleon Trade. These developments enabled more efficient transport of goods, facilitated the movement of labor, and strengthened the connection between local economies and global trade networks. Indigenous and migrant labor were mobilized for construction projects, demonstrating the integration of local populations into colonial economic strategies. Administrative reform was pursued in parallel with economic measures. The colonial government sought to improve efficiency in taxation, legal administration, and governance by standardizing procedures across provinces. Indigenous leaders, particularly barangay chiefs and principales, were incorporated into administrative structures to oversee tribute collection, labor obligations, and local dispute resolution. This co-optation maintained local political stability while ensuring compliance with Spanish directives. Military organization was also strengthened, with garrisons stationed in strategic locations to monitor both internal resistance and external threats. The British occupation of Manila, 1762 to 1764, during the 7 Years' War exposed vulnerabilities in Spanish colonial authority and underscored the strategic importance of the archipelago. British forces seized Manila and the surrounding settlements, taking advantage of the Spanish preoccupation with global conflict. The occupation disrupted trade, administration, and religious operations and demonstrated the limitations of Spanish defense in the face of well-organized European military intervention. Local leaders responded variably, with some collaborating with the British while others resisted, reflecting the complex interplay of loyalty, pragmatism, and opportunism among indigenous elites. Spanish authorities, aided by loyalist militias and provincial support, eventually regained control of Manila through negotiation and military engagement. The experience highlighted the need for stronger fortifications, improved military readiness, and more effective coordination between colonial administration and local communities. Social and religious institutions played a stabilizing role during this period. The Catholic Church maintained influence over education, moral guidance, and community organization. Parishes continued to serve as centers for religious, social, and administrative activity, reinforcing Spanish authority while providing services such as schooling and dispute mediation. Missionaries expanded outreach to remote provinces, adapting religious instruction to local languages and practices. The church also played a role in promoting agricultural and artisanal skills, facilitating the integration of economic reform with religious instruction. Despite these reforms, resistance persisted in regions beyond direct Spanish control. In Mindanao and Sulu, Islamic sultanates maintained political autonomy, defended trade networks, and resisted tribute collection. These communities leveraged strategic alliances, fortifications, and naval capabilities to protect territorial sovereignty. Periodic military expeditions by Spanish forces were launched to assert authority, resulting in localized conflict but rarely achieving full control. Highland groups in northern Luzon, including the Igorot and Ifugao, preserved autonomous governance and agricultural practices, resisting both administrative integration and religious conversion. These persistent zones of independence required ongoing negotiation, military vigilance, and strategic alliances to maintain colonial influence without overextending resources. Cultural adaptation and exchange were ongoing throughout the 18th century. Spanish influence affected language, art, architecture, and education, particularly in urban and central regions. Indigenous populations adopted European agricultural techniques, metalworking skills, and building methods, while continuing traditional practices in daily life and social organization. Catholic festivals, rituals, and ceremonies became integrated with local customs, creating hybrid cultural forms that reinforced both religious and social cohesion. Literacy in Spanish increased among the colonial elite and the principales, while local languages remained dominant in everyday communication and rural communities. Trade and commerce continued to evolve during this century. The Manila Acapulco Galleon Trade remained the backbone of the colonial economy, linking the Philippines to global markets and providing a steady flow of goods, labor, and capital. Chinese merchants played a central role in trade operations, supplying manufactured goods, luxury items, and technical expertise. Indigenous labor supported production, transport, and market activity, ensuring participation in the economic system while retaining localized control over agricultural and artisanal output. Trade networks also connected local producers to regional markets in Southeast Asia, reinforcing the archipelago's role as a hub in both global and regional commerce. Population dynamics were influenced by urbanization, migration, and economic opportunity. Manila and other key settlements grew as administrative, commercial, and religious centers, attracting labor, artisans, and merchants. Indigenous populations continued to reside in rural barangays, maintaining subsistence agriculture, local governance, and social networks. Migration from neighboring regions, including Chinese traders and laborers, contributed to demographic diversity and economic activity. Colonial authorities implemented policies to regulate population distribution, labor obligations, and taxation, balancing the needs of administration with the capacities of local communities. Environmental and health management was also a concern during this period. Spanish authorities promoted the construction of water systems, roads, and public buildings to support urban centers and agricultural zones. Epidemics and localized outbreaks of disease were managed through coordination with missionary institutions, local leaders, and colonial administrators. Agricultural expansion required careful adaptation to local soil, climate, and topography, leading to ongoing integration of indigenous knowledge with colonial policies. By the end of the 18th century, the Philippine colonial system had achieved significant stability and integration in Luzon and the Visayas, while Mindanao, Sulu, and the highland regions maintained partial autonomy. Reforms in agriculture, trade, administration, and religious outreach strengthened Spanish authority and expanded the scope of governance. External challenges, such as the British occupation, highlighted vulnerabilities and prompted improvements in fortifications, military readiness, and strategic coordination. Indigenous leaders continued to exercise influence within the colonial system, negotiating authority, tribute obligations, and labor responsibilities while preserving aspects of local governance and culture. The 18th century demonstrates a balance between consolidation and challenge. Spanish authorities implemented policies to optimize economic productivity, reinforce political authority, and expand religious influence, while remaining responsive to external threats and internal resistance. Indigenous communities adapted to new administrative structures, integrated select European practices, and resisted overreach where possible. The interaction of these factors established a complex and resilient colonial system that persisted into the 19th century, providing the foundation for subsequent political, social, and economic developments in the Philippine archipelago. The first half of the 19th century in the Philippine archipelago was characterized by gradual economic liberalization, social transformation, and the emergence of a distinct class of educated Filipinos. By 1800, Spanish colonial rule was well established in Luzon and the Visayas, reinforced by administrative, military, and religious systems. The Manila Acapulco Galleon Trade, which had dominated the colonial economy since the 16th century, was in decline due to shifts in global trade patterns, competition from other European powers, and logistical limitations. This economic transition prompted reforms and opened new avenues for commerce, governance, and social mobility, laying the groundwork for nationalist consciousness later in the century. One of the most significant developments during this period was the opening of Manila to world trade in 1834. The liberalization policy, implemented under the Spanish crown, ended the monopoly of the galleon trade and allowed foreign merchants, including British and American traders, to operate directly in the archipelago. This policy expanded economic opportunities, increased access to global markets, and introduced new commodities such as textiles, manufactured goods, and agricultural tools. Indigenous and Chinese merchants played a key role as intermediaries, facilitating the distribution of imported goods to local communities and supplying raw materials and agricultural produce for export. The influx of foreign trade stimulated urban growth, particularly in Manila and Cebu, and contributed to the emergence of a commercial elite that bridged local and global economic networks. Economic liberalization also intersected with administrative and social reform. Spanish authorities sought to streamline taxation, improve revenue collection, and standardize local governance. Indigenous leaders, particularly the principales and barangay chiefs, continued to play crucial intermediary roles, implementing tribute collection, labor obligations, and local dispute resolution. Reforms included adjustments to land tenure systems, promotion of agricultural production, and efforts to encourage industrial activity, such as weaving, ceramics, and shipbuilding. These policies reflected the colonial administration's intent to increase efficiency, expand fiscal capacity, and integrate the archipelago more fully into the global economy. During this period, a new class of educated Filipinos, known as the ilustrados, began to emerge. These individuals were often the children of local elites who had access to primary education in the Philippines and, increasingly, secondary and higher education in Spain and other European countries. The ilustrados acquired knowledge of European languages, literature, philosophy, law, and political theory, enabling them to critically assess colonial governance and develop reformist ideas. The growth of this class coincided with the establishment of schools and institutions aimed at educating the local population, including parochial schools and institutions run by religious orders. Literacy and intellectual engagement expanded, particularly in urban centers, creating the foundation for a politically conscious elite. Social reforms during the early 19th century were gradual but significant. Urban centers became sites of cultural and intellectual exchange, hosting discussions on governance, trade, religion, and social organization. Local elites navigated between traditional responsibilities and new opportunities created by Spanish liberalization, participating in economic ventures, municipal governance, and educational initiatives. Religious instruction continued to shape social norms, while exposure to European ideas through education and trade introduced alternative frameworks for governance, rights, and civic engagement. Political tensions arose from the contrast between colonial authority and local aspirations. While Spanish administrators maintained control over Luzon and the Visayas, discontent persisted due to corruption, heavy taxation, forced labor, and social restrictions. Indigenous and mestizo populations negotiated their roles within the colonial system, occasionally resisting policies perceived as exploitative. In this context, reformist thought began to develop among the educated elite, particularly those who had studied abroad and were aware of European liberal and constitutional ideas. These individuals would later play critical roles in the propaganda movement and nationalist advocacy. The period also witnessed the Cavite Mutiny of January 20th, 1872, a significant turning point in early Philippine nationalism. The mutiny involved a small group of Filipino workers and soldiers at the Spanish arsenal in Cavite who protested against reductions in privileges and additional taxes imposed by the colonial administration. Although the revolt was limited in scale, the Spanish authorities perceived it as a broader threat and responded with severe repression. The suppression led to the execution of 3 Filipino priests, Mariano Gomez, Jose Burgos, and Jacinto Zamora, collectively known as Gamborza, who were accused of fomenting rebellion. Their deaths had a profound impact on the Filipino intelligentsia and emerging reformist movements, catalyzing the rise of nationalist sentiment and organized calls for social and political change. Religious institutions played an ongoing role in mediating both reform and social control. Catholic parishes remained centers of education, literacy, and moral instruction, while missionary orders monitored compliance with Spanish law and social norms. At the same time, tensions arose between Filipino clergy and Spanish friars over issues of authority, access to parish leadership, and treatment of local populations. These conflicts highlighted the growing divide between colonial authorities and local communities, as well as the increasing assertiveness of Filipinos seeking reform and recognition within both religious and civil institutions. Intellectual activity during this period contributed directly to the formation of early nationalist consciousness. Filipino reformers, particularly members of the Ilustrado class, began to engage with European political philosophy, legal theory, and social critique. Journals, newspapers, and pamphlets became vehicles for expressing reformist ideas, advocating for equality under Spanish law, representation in government, secularization of the clergy, and improvements in public education. These activities reflected the ability of the educated elite to critically evaluate the colonial system and propose changes while remaining initially within legal and intellectual channels rather than armed conflict. Infrastructure development continued alongside these reforms. Roads, bridges, and urban facilities were expanded to facilitate commerce, communication, and administrative efficiency. Ports, including those in Manila, Cavite, and Cebu, were improved to support increased trade and navigation. Agricultural and industrial development, coupled with transportation improvements, enhanced regional connectivity and integrated provincial economies into a more cohesive colonial framework. Indigenous populations provided labor and technical expertise, adapting local knowledge to support Spanish initiatives in construction, agriculture, and trade. The convergence of economic liberalization, educational advancement, and early nationalist sentiment set the stage for the subsequent revolutionary movements of the late 19th century. By the early 1870s, the combination of global exposure, domestic economic change, and social reform had created a politically aware and reform-minded Filipino elite. These developments reflected both the opportunities and constraints of Spanish colonial rule, highlighting the interplay of adaptation, resistance, and negotiation between local populations and European authorities. In summary, the period from 1800 to 1872 was marked by economic opening, social transformation, and the emergence of reformist nationalism. The liberalization of trade, the rise of the Ilustrado class, and reforms in governance, education, and infrastructure all contributed to an evolving colonial society in which local agency became increasingly evident. The Cavite Mutiny and the execution of Gamborza crystallized early nationalist sentiment, demonstrating the potential for organized political awareness and laying the intellectual and social foundations for subsequent reformist and revolutionary movements. The period from 1872 to 1896 in the Philippine archipelago was defined by the rise of organized reformist movements, reflecting growing discontent with Spanish colonial rule and the emergence of an educated Filipino elite. The execution of Gomez, Burgos, and Zamora, Gamborza, in 1872, following the Cavite Mutiny, served as a critical catalyst for political awareness. These events galvanized the Ilustrados, an emerging class of educated Filipinos who had received advanced education in Spain, the Philippines, and other European countries. The Ilustrados began to develop reformist ideas advocating for social, political, and religious change, seeking to improve conditions under Spanish colonial governance while remaining initially within legal and intellectual frameworks. One of the primary avenues for reform was the propaganda movement, which emerged in the 1880s in Europe, primarily in Spain and Paris. Filipino reformers, including Jose Rizal, Marcelo H. del Pilar, Graciano Lopez Gina, and other members of the Ilustrado class, used publications, correspondence, and lectures to advocate for political and social reforms. The movement called for representation of the Philippines in the Spanish Cortes, equality under Spanish law, secularization of the clergy, freedom of the press, and educational reforms. These reformist objectives were grounded in European liberal thought, emphasizing civil rights, rational governance, and legal equality. Jose Rizal became the central figure of the reformist movement through his writings, which critically examined Spanish colonial rule and its impact on Philippine society. His novel Nali Mi Tanhair, 1887, depicted the abuses of the colonial administration and the friar-dominated ecclesiastical system, illustrating the social, political, and moral challenges faced by Filipinos. El Filibusterismo, 1891, followed, emphasizing the need for systemic reform and exposing the consequences of entrenched corruption and oppression. Rizal's works were widely circulated among the Filipino intelligentsia and reform-minded elites, both in the Philippines and abroad, fostering awareness and debate about colonial policies and social conditions. Other reformists, such as Marcelo H. del Pilar and Graciano Lopez Gina, contributed through journalism and public advocacy. Del Pilar edited and published La Solidaridad, the principal newspaper of the propaganda movement, which articulated demands for legal reforms, secularization of parishes, and broader political representation. Lopez Gina delivered speeches and essays advocating for equality, rational governance, and social justice. These reformist publications were critical in shaping the political consciousness of educated Filipinos and facilitating communication between the archipelago and Europe, creating a transnational network of advocacy and reform. Education was a significant element in the propagation of reformist ideas. The establishment of secular schools, the expansion of public education, and the access of the illustrado class to European universities provided opportunities for critical engagement with political philosophy, law, and governance. Literacy in Spanish and exposure to European legal and political theory enabled Filipino reformers to articulate specific demands for administrative, religious, and social change. The growth of this educated elite facilitated organized intellectual opposition to Spanish policies while maintaining a legalistic and reform-oriented approach during this period. Religious reform was a central concern of the movement. Spanish friars held significant control over parishes, education, and social life, often resulting in abuses of power and corruption. Reformists called for the secularization of parishes, arguing that Filipino priests should be allowed to lead local congregations without interference from Spanish clergy. The issue of clerical control became a flashpoint for broader discontent, highlighting systemic inequities and the need for structural reform. The Church remained a powerful institution, and disputes between reformists and friars reflected the intersection of religion, governance, and social hierarchy within the colonial system. Political reform within the archipelago was also a key focus. The propaganda movement advocated for the inclusion of the Philippines in the Spanish Cortes, arguing that Filipinos were Spanish subjects entitled to representation and the protection of civil rights. These proposals aimed to provide legal mechanisms for addressing grievances related to taxation, labor obligations, and governance, reflecting a preference for reform over immediate revolutionary action. While these efforts were largely unsuccessful in achieving legislative change, they served to formalize political discourse and articulate the principles that would later underpin the nationalist and revolutionary movements. The period also saw the development of civic organizations and social networks designed to promote reform. Filipino reformists organized associations such as the Asociación Hispano-Filipina and other local societies that facilitated discussion, education, and advocacy. These organizations provided platforms for collective action, communication with European authorities, and coordination of reformist initiatives. Participation in these societies strengthened the capacity of the Filipino elite to articulate policy proposals, mobilize support, and build a shared understanding of rights, obligations, and governance within the colonial context. Economic and social conditions influenced the reformist agenda. While trade and commerce continued to develop, particularly in urban centers, many indigenous and mestizo populations faced inequality, limited access to resources, and labor exploitation. The reformists highlighted these disparities, advocating for improved education, equitable taxation, legal protection, and administrative transparency. Urbanization and participation in commercial networks contributed to social stratification, providing the illustrados with both the awareness and the means to challenge systemic inequalities. The Spanish colonial administration responded to reformist activity with surveillance, censorship, and legal restrictions. Publications such as La Solidaridad were closely monitored, and reformists in the Philippines were often harassed or subjected to restrictions on movement and communication. Despite these measures, the movement persisted, utilizing both domestic networks and international connections to maintain advocacy efforts. The resilience of reformist organizations and individuals demonstrated the growing capacity of the Filipino elite to engage in structured political and intellectual opposition while operating within the colonial framework. The period from 1872 to 1896 culminated in growing tensions between reformist ideals and the limitations of Spanish colonial authority. While the propaganda movement emphasized legal and intellectual avenues for change, widespread social inequalities, abuse of power, and lack of political representation persisted. These structural constraints, combined with the experiences of repression, censorship, and marginalization, laid the groundwork for the emergence of revolutionary movements in the late 19th century. The reformist agenda articulated principles of civil rights, governance, and equality that would later serve as ideological foundations for the struggle for independence. During this period, communication and transportation infrastructure contributed to the dissemination of reformist ideas. Urban centers such as Manila, Cebu, and Vigan became nodes of information exchange, where newspapers, pamphlets, and educational institutions circulated knowledge. Maritime trade facilitated the movement of ideas alongside goods, linking Filipino reformists with intellectual networks in Spain, France, and other European countries. These connections enabled the articulation of reformist demands in the context of global political thought and allowed local elites to measure Spanish colonial governance against broader European standards. By 1896, the limitations of the reformist approach became apparent. While the propaganda movement had succeeded in raising awareness, educating the populace, and articulating clear policy demands, it had not achieved substantive political change. Spanish authorities largely ignored calls for representation, secularization, and legal equality, reinforcing the perception that reform within the existing colonial framework was insufficient. The continued oppression of local populations, coupled with the failures of legal and intellectual advocacy, contributed to the radicalization of segments of the population and the formation of revolutionary organizations. The period from 1896 to 1898 marked the transition from reformist advocacy to organized armed struggle against Spanish colonial rule, culminating in the Declaration of Philippine Independence. The failure of reformist movements to achieve substantive political change, coupled with widespread social and economic grievances, provided the context for revolutionary organization. The revolution was initiated by the Katipunan, a secret revolutionary society founded by Andres Bonifacio on July 7, 1892. The Katipunan aimed to achieve independence through armed resistance, establishing a revolutionary network across Luzon, Visayas, and parts of Mindanao. On August 23, 1896, the Philippine Revolution officially began, following the discovery of the Katipunan by Spanish authorities. The outbreak was marked by localized uprisings in Manila, Cavite, and surrounding provinces. Leaders of the Katipunan mobilized members through clandestine networks, employing secrecy, oaths of loyalty, and hierarchical organization to coordinate attacks and defend communities. Early engagements focused on the seizure of strategic locations, the disruption of Spanish military operations, and the protection of local populations sympathetic to revolutionary aims. Cavite quickly became the center of revolutionary activity under the leadership of Emilio Aguinaldo, who would later emerge as a central figure in the revolution. Revolutionary forces in Cavite achieved significant victories, securing towns and establishing provisional governance structures to manage civil and military affairs. The organization of revolutionary councils, allocation of resources, and implementation of justice mechanisms demonstrated the capacity of the movement to function as an alternative administrative authority. The Katipunan and affiliated forces combined guerrilla tactics with coordinated assaults on Spanish positions, capitalizing on knowledge of local geography and population support. The revolution coincided with broader societal discontent. Rural communities faced burdensome taxation, forced labor, and the dominance of Spanish friars over economic, religious, and social life. These factors contributed to widespread support for revolutionary action, particularly in areas where the Katipunan had established networks of communication and mutual aid. Local leaders and villagers provided intelligence, resources, and logistical support, enabling revolutionary forces to sustain operations despite Spanish military pressure. A significant event during this period was the execution of José Rizal on December 30th, 1896, in Manila. Rizal had been implicated by Spanish authorities as an intellectual inspiration for the revolution, due to his writings and influence among reformists and revolutionaries. His execution was intended by Spanish officials to suppress revolutionary sentiment, but it had the opposite effect, galvanizing support for armed resistance. The martyrdom of Rizal strengthened nationalist resolve, increasing recruitment and commitment among revolutionary forces and reinforcing the ideological basis of the struggle for independence. Military engagements during the revolution were diverse, reflecting the strategic, geographic, and social complexities of the archipelago. In Luzon, battles were concentrated in Cavite, Laguna, and Bulacan, while skirmishes and uprisings occurred in Manila, Pampanga, Batangas, and other provinces. Revolutionary forces often relied on improvised weaponry, local knowledge, and mobility to counter Spanish garrisons. Spanish authorities responded with reinforcements, punitive expeditions, and martial law in affected provinces, attempting to suppress the movement through military and administrative measures. Despite these efforts, revolutionary forces maintained territorial control in key regions, demonstrating organizational resilience and strategic planning. The revolution also involved efforts to establish governance structures independent of Spanish authority. Revolutionary leaders created provincial councils, military commands, and judicial systems to administer liberated areas, collect resources, and regulate social order. These structures reflected the capacity of revolutionary forces to function as a de facto government, providing services and security in contested territories. Coordination between regional commands and local leaders was essential to sustain resistance, manage logistics, and ensure communication across dispersed populations. Naval and coastal operations were limited during this period, but strategically relevant in areas such as Cavite and the Visayas. Control of rivers, coastal towns, and ports facilitated the movement of men and resources and allowed revolutionary forces to maintain connections between inland and maritime communities. Spanish forces attempted to secure key coastal positions to restrict supplies and isolate insurgent territories, but the mobility and local support of revolutionary groups often undermined these efforts. The revolutionary movement was marked by internal dynamics and leadership disputes. While Andres Bonifacio initially led the Katipunan, leadership tensions emerged as the conflict progressed, particularly with the rise of Emilio Aguinaldo and the Revolutionary Council in Cavite. Differences in strategy, political vision, and organizational authority led to the consolidation of power under Aguinaldo in 1897, following a series of assemblies and internal decisions. Bonifacio was subsequently executed under revolutionary authority, reflecting the complexities of leadership, legitimacy, and decision-making within the insurgent movement. In 1897, the Pact of Biaknabito temporarily suspended hostilities, following negotiations between Aguinaldo and Spanish authorities. The agreement established conditions for a truce, the release of prisoners, and financial arrangements, while allowing revolutionary leaders to go into exile in Hong Kong. The truce provided an opportunity for the movement to reorganize, acquire resources, and plan for future engagements. However, underlying grievances and aspirations for independence remained unresolved, ensuring that revolutionary activity would resume in subsequent years. By early 1898, the geopolitical context of the revolution shifted with the outbreak of the Spanish-American War. On April 25, 1898, U.S. forces engaged Spanish forces in Manila Bay, and the Battle of Manila Bay on May 1, 1898 destroyed the Spanish fleet. This international conflict directly affected the Philippine revolutionary movement, providing both opportunities and challenges. Revolutionary forces under Aguinaldo returned from exile with support from U.S. forces, re-establishing operations in northern Luzon and expanding territorial control. Collaboration with external powers was pragmatic and focused on achieving strategic objectives, including the ultimate goal of national independence. On June 12, 1898, the Philippine Declaration of Independence was formally proclaimed in Kawit, Cavite. Emilio Aguinaldo raised the national flag, and a symbolic ceremony marked the establishment of a provisional government. The declaration was a culmination of organized revolutionary action, reflecting both the military successes of the Katipunan and the broader nationalist aspirations of Filipino society. While independence was not immediately recognized internationally, the declaration represented a tangible assertion of sovereignty and the capacity of Filipino leaders to organize governance, military defense, and social order within liberated territories. During this period, revolutionary forces continued to consolidate control over provinces in Luzon and parts of the Visayas. Military, administrative, and logistical structures were developed to sustain the movement and manage civil affairs in areas no longer under Spanish authority. Revolutionary councils coordinated local governance, judicial processes, taxation, and supply chains, integrating civil and military functions. The movement demonstrated a capacity to adapt to evolving circumstances, respond to internal and external challenges, and sustain operations across diverse geographic and social contexts. The Philippine Revolution of 1896 to 1898 illustrates the transition from intellectual reform to organized armed struggle. The combination of social grievances, leadership organization, military strategy, and intellectual influence created a sustained movement capable of challenging entrenched colonial authority. Revolutionary efforts integrated armed resistance with the creation of governance structures, highlighting the capacity of Filipino leaders to assert sovereignty and manage civil affairs. The period established precedents in military organization, political leadership, and social mobilization that would continue to shape Philippine history into the 20th century. The period from 1898 to 1902 marked the transition of the Philippine archipelago from Spanish colonial rule to American occupation, intertwined with the assertion of Filipino sovereignty through the establishment of the First Philippine Republic. The Philippine Revolution, which had begun in 1896, intersected with the broader geopolitical context of the Spanish-American War, resulting in a complex sequence of military, political, and diplomatic developments that shaped the future of the nation. The Spanish-American War, initiated on April 25, 1898, significantly altered the dynamics of power in the Philippines. The U.S. Navy, commanded by Commodore George Dewey, engaged the Spanish fleet at Manila Bay on May 1, 1898, decisively defeating the Spanish naval forces. The Battle of Manila Bay effectively eliminated Spanish maritime dominance and provided a strategic advantage for U.S. operations in the archipelago. The victory also influenced the calculations of Filipino revolutionary leaders, particularly Emilio Aguinaldo, who had recently returned from exile in Hong Kong to re-establish insurgent control in Luzon. Following Dewey's naval victory, Aguinaldo coordinated with local revolutionary forces to expand territorial control in northern and central Luzon. Revolutionary councils established governance structures in captured areas, administered justice, managed resources, and organized military operations against remaining Spanish garrisons. The coordination of civil and military functions reflected an effort to consolidate authority and demonstrate the capacity of the Filipino leadership to operate as an autonomous political entity. Local populations were involved in logistical support, intelligence gathering, and participation in provisional governance, reinforcing the legitimacy of the revolutionary government. The formal establishment of the First Philippine Republic occurred on January 23, 1899 in Malolos, Bulacan. The Malolos Congress ratified a constitution that defined the structure of the new government, including executive, legislative, and judicial branches. Emilio Aguinaldo was inaugurated as president, and the republic asserted sovereignty over the archipelago, instituting policies on civil administration, taxation, and military organization. The Malolos Constitution emphasized the separation of powers, civil liberties, and representative governance, reflecting the influence of both Spanish legal traditions and liberal political ideas acquired by Filipino reformists and revolutionary leaders. The Spanish withdrawal and U.S. occupation created a complex transitional environment. The Treaty of Paris, signed on December 10, 1898, transferred control of the Philippines from Spain to the United States for $20 million U.S. dollars. The treaty did not include Filipino representatives in the negotiations, effectively disregarding the sovereignty claimed by the First Philippine Republic. The imposition of U.S. authority and the failure to recognize Filipino independence led to tensions and, eventually, armed conflict between American forces and Filipino revolutionary troops. The Philippine-American War, which began on February 4, 1899, was the direct result of the refusal of U.S. forces to acknowledge Filipino sovereignty. Initial engagements occurred in Manila and surrounding provinces, where both sides utilized conventional and guerrilla tactics. Filipino forces, organized under the command of Aguinaldo and regional military leaders, sought to defend territorial control, maintain civil administration, and preserve national sovereignty. American forces employed superior weaponry, coordinated military campaigns, and occupation strategies to subdue resistance, combining conventional battles with strategic pacification campaigns in rural areas. The conflict involved both military and civilian dimensions, with revolutionary forces continuing governance operations in areas under their control while managing supplies, logistics, and civil affairs. Filipino troops utilized knowledge of local terrain, support from sympathetic communities, and mobility to counter the superior firepower of U.S. forces. However, sustained military pressure, attrition, and systematic occupation eventually eroded the operational capacity of revolutionary forces, compelling shifts in strategy and the adoption of guerrilla warfare tactics. During the war, civilians were affected by displacement, requisitioning of resources, and localized violence, reflecting the broader social impact of military campaigns. The Filipino revolutionary government continued to issue proclamations, organize local councils, and maintain judicial and administrative functions where possible. Efforts to uphold governance structures under conditions of war highlighted the capacity of the First Philippine Republic to maintain a degree of civil authority and social order despite military challenges and external occupation. The capture of key towns and provinces by U.S. forces gradually limited the operational reach of the First Philippine Republic. By the late 1900s, American military campaigns had effectively isolated Aguinaldo and core revolutionary units, compelling the Republic to adopt mobile headquarters and decentralized command structures. Filipino forces continued resistance through small-scale engagements, raids, and strategic withdrawals, adapting to the asymmetrical nature of the conflict. These strategies prolonged the conflict and demonstrated both the resilience and limitations of revolutionary military organization under occupation. Aguinaldo's capture on March 23, 1901 in Palanan, Isabela, marked a turning point in the Philippine-American War. Following his capture, Aguinaldo swore allegiance to the United States, signaling the effective dissolution of centralized revolutionary authority. Regional commanders and guerrilla units continued resistance in some provinces, but coordinated operations declined significantly. The U.S. administration implemented policies to pacify and integrate the archipelago, including the establishment of civil government, infrastructure development, and the introduction of public education. These measures were designed to consolidate American authority, provide governance functions, and reduce the capacity for renewed insurgency. The official end of the Philippine-American War was declared on July 4, 1902, although sporadic resistance persisted in Mindanao, Sulu, and Highland regions. The conclusion of the conflict marked the beginning of formal American colonial administration, including the introduction of civil governance under Governor-General William Howard Taft. American policies emphasized modernization of infrastructure, education, legal systems, and public health, alongside efforts to integrate local elites into administrative roles. This transition reflected both pragmatic considerations for governance and an attempt to consolidate authority while reducing the likelihood of renewed organized resistance. The period from 1898 to 1902 illustrates the interplay between revolutionary nationalism and external geopolitical forces. Filipino revolutionary leaders sought to establish sovereignty, organize government, and defend territorial integrity against both residual Spanish authority and the incoming American administration. The First Philippine Republic represented an early effort at constitutional governance, institutionalized administration, and national organization, demonstrating both political ambition and operational capability. The American takeover and subsequent war highlighted the challenges of asserting sovereignty in the context of global imperial competition, the asymmetry of military power, and the complexities of governance during transitional periods. The legacies of this period include the establishment of constitutional frameworks, the demonstration of organized revolutionary governance, and the articulation of Filipino aspirations for independence. The interactions between revolutionary forces and American military and civil authorities shaped subsequent colonial administration, set precedents for local participation in governance, and provided experiences that informed later independence movements. Social, economic, and political structures developed during this period continued to influence the archipelago into the 20th century. The period from 1902 to 1935 represents the formal establishment and consolidation of American colonial governance in the Philippine archipelago, following the conclusion of the Philippine-American War. The cessation of organized military resistance on July 4, 1902 allowed the United States to shift from military occupation to civil administration, emphasizing the development of public institutions, infrastructure, education, and governance systems intended to modernize the colony and prepare it for eventual self-government. The civil government was formally established under Governor-General William Howard Taft, who assumed office on July 4, 1901 during the transition from military to civil authority. Taft's administration prioritized administrative reorganization, judicial reform, fiscal management, and the establishment of civil liberties within a framework defined by the United States. Key policies included codifying laws, implementing local government reforms, and promoting the participation of Filipino elites in governance through advisory and elective positions. The Philippine Commission, composed initially of American officials with limited Filipino participation, oversaw legislative and administrative functions until the Philippine Assembly was inaugurated in 1907, providing a legislative body with elected Filipino representatives. A significant focus during the American colonial period was the introduction of public education. The Americans established a comprehensive educational system designed to promote literacy, civic understanding, and practical skills. The Thomasites, a group of American teachers who arrived in 1901, played a central role in introducing English as the medium of instruction, standardizing curricula, and training local teachers. Schools were established in both urban and rural areas, providing education in reading, writing, mathematics, history, and vocational skills. By the 1920s, the Philippine educational system had expanded extensively, producing a literate and politically aware population that would later participate in governance and national development. Infrastructure development was another priority of the American administration. Roads, bridges, ports, and railways were constructed or improved to facilitate communication, commerce, and military mobility. Urban centers, including Manila, Cebu, and Iloilo, received modernized sanitation, water supply, and transportation systems. Agricultural production was supported through irrigation projects, the introduction of new crops, and technical guidance. The development of infrastructure aimed both to integrate the archipelago's regions and to facilitate economic growth, providing a foundation for long-term modernization. Local governance reforms were implemented through the Philippine Organic Act of 1902, which established a framework for municipal and provincial administration. Filipino participation in local councils and elective offices allowed for limited self-governance while maintaining overall American authority. These reforms included tax collection, municipal planning, public works, and social services, providing Filipino elites with administrative experience and familiarity with modern governance practices. Over time, elected Filipino representatives assumed increasing responsibilities, contributing to the political development of the archipelago. The Jones Law of 1916 marked a significant milestone in the progression toward independence. Officially titled the Philippine Autonomy Act, the law promised eventual self-government and restructured the Philippine legislature to include a fully elected Senate and House of Representatives. It affirmed the U.S. commitment to Filipino political development, expanded civil liberties, and emphasized participation in policymaking. The law also reflected an evolving American approach, balancing colonial authority with gradual democratization and preparing the archipelago for eventual sovereignty. Social reforms during the American period included public health initiatives, the professionalization of civil service, and the establishment of judicial and administrative systems. Hospitals, sanitation projects, and campaigns against endemic diseases such as cholera, smallpox, and malaria improved public health outcomes. Legal reforms standardized procedures and strengthened the judiciary, providing mechanisms for dispute resolution and the enforcement of civil and criminal law. These reforms were intended to establish the rule of law, institutional stability, and confidence in governance. Economic policies under American rule emphasized market integration, agricultural productivity, and commercial expansion. The archipelago's economy is increasingly oriented toward exports, particularly sugar, hemp, coconut, and tobacco, often produced in large estates under local and foreign management. Urban centers became hubs for trade, banking, and services, linked both internally and to global markets. American economic policies aimed to stabilize production, introduce technical expertise, and integrate the Philippine economy with the broader American market, fostering both growth and dependency. Political movements during this period reflected a range of perspectives on the pace and nature of self-government. Parties such as the Progresista Party and the Nacionalista Party emerged, advocating for differing approaches to autonomy, governance, and eventual independence. Nationalist discourse emphasized Filipino participation in administration, educational reform, and the development of a civic identity. Debates over policy, representation, and collaboration with American authorities shaped the political landscape and prepared the archipelago for the next stage of self-rule. Legislation in the 1930s formalized the path toward Philippine independence. The Hare-Hawes Cutting Act of 1933 and the Tidings McDuffie Act of 1934 established a timetable for transition to full sovereignty, providing for a 10-year Commonwealth period before complete independence. The legislation defined the structure of the Commonwealth government, outlined constitutional provisions, and confirmed U.S. authority during the transitional period. These acts marked the culmination of decades of political development and engagement, institutionalizing a process for transferring governance to Filipino leaders while maintaining security and administrative continuity under U.S. supervision. Throughout the American colonial period, the archipelago experienced a combination of modernization, social transformation, and political development. Educational expansion produced a literate and politically aware population. Infrastructure improvements facilitated commerce, communication, and administration. Legal and judicial reforms created mechanisms for governance and conflict resolution. Local participation in municipal and provincial administration fostered administrative experience and political acumen among Filipino elites. At the same time, economic integration into global markets, reliance on American policies, and social stratification reflected ongoing challenges within the colonial framework. The period from 1935 to 1941 represents the transition of the Philippine archipelago from American colonial administration toward planned full independence through the establishment of the Commonwealth of the Philippines. This period was characterized by the institutionalization of a constitutional government, the consolidation of political structures, and the implementation of economic, social, and defense policies aimed at preparing the nation for sovereignty. The Commonwealth government was inaugurated on November 15, 1935, following the ratification of the 1935 Philippine Constitution. Manuel L. Quezon was elected as the first president of the Commonwealth, and Sergio Osmina served as vice president. The Constitution established a presidential system of government with three branches: executive, legislative, and judicial. It provided for a 10-year transitional period under which the Philippines would exercise autonomy, while the United States retained responsibility for defense and foreign policy. The structure of government was designed to balance democratic principles, administrative efficiency, and legal continuity with existing colonial institutions, ensuring a stable transition toward full sovereignty. The inauguration of the Commonwealth formalized national institutions and centralized governance. Executive authority, vested in the president, included oversight of internal administration, public works, education, finance, and policy implementation. The National Assembly, composed of elected representatives, served as the legislative body responsible for lawmaking, budgeting, and oversight of the executive branch. The judiciary, based on the American system with adaptations to local legal traditions, maintained civil and criminal adjudication and reinforced the rule of law. These institutional arrangements provided mechanisms for policy continuity, administrative efficiency, and citizen participation in governance. Defense preparedness was a major focus of the Commonwealth. Although the United States retained responsibility for national defense, the Philippine government established the Philippine Army and developed programs for military training, infrastructure, and logistics. The creation of a national military force was intended to provide internal security, prepare for eventual full sovereignty, and ensure a capable administrative presence in strategic areas. The Commonwealth also promoted the establishment of military academies, reserve forces, and local militias to train officers and personnel who could support national defense objectives. Economic policy during the Commonwealth emphasized agricultural development, trade expansion, and infrastructure modernization. The government pursued initiatives to increase productivity in rice, sugar, coconut, and other key crops, including programs for irrigation, technical guidance, and rural credit. Infrastructure projects included road construction, port modernization, and expansion of transportation networks to facilitate commerce, improve internal connectivity, and integrate regional economies. Policies sought to balance modernization with stability, enabling both urban and rural populations to participate in national economic development. Education remained a priority, continuing the expansion and standardization initiated during the American colonial period. The Commonwealth administration extended access to primary, secondary, and vocational education, emphasizing English as the medium of instruction. Public schools were supplemented by teacher training programs, the establishment of higher education institutions, and scholarships for study abroad. These initiatives aim to produce an educated population capable of participating in governance, economic activity, and national administration. Public health and sanitation programs complemented educational initiatives, reducing the prevalence of communicable diseases and improving overall living conditions. Social reforms included efforts to promote labor rights, social welfare, and civic engagement. The Commonwealth government enacted legislation regulating labor conditions, providing protections for workers, and establishing mechanisms for dispute resolution. Programs were introduced to support public health, maternal and child welfare, and rural development. Civic institutions, such as local councils and municipal offices, were strengthened to facilitate community participation in governance, public service delivery, and policy implementation. These measures were designed to reinforce administrative capacity, improve social equity, and foster national cohesion. The Commonwealth period also involved political consolidation and party organization. The Nacionalista Party, dominant during this era, guided the formulation of national policy, legislative priorities, and governance strategies. Internal political debates addressed questions of economic policy, defense strategy, social reform, and preparation for independence. Political institutions provided a framework for electoral participation, representation, and administrative accountability, contributing to the development of a functioning democratic system and the cultivation of political leadership capable of managing national affairs. International relations during the Commonwealth period were shaped by the transitional nature of sovereignty. The United States retained authority over foreign policy and defense, while the Philippine government maintained limited engagement in international trade, diplomacy, and economic agreements. The Commonwealth negotiated trade policies, tariff arrangements, and participation in regional economic networks to support national economic development and integration. These policies reflected the dual objectives of autonomy in domestic affairs and reliance on U.S. authority in external matters. The onset of Japanese aggression in East Asia introduced a strategic dimension to Commonwealth governance. By the late 1930s, Japan's expansionist policies and the outbreak of conflicts in China and the Pacific region heightened concerns about national security. The Commonwealth implemented measures to strengthen defense, including coordination with U.S. forces, fortification of strategic areas, and expansion of military training programs. These preparations, although constrained by the limitations of transitional sovereignty, reflected awareness of regional geopolitical threats and the need to protect territorial integrity in the context of global conflict. Agricultural and economic initiatives were complemented by efforts to promote industrial development. The Commonwealth encouraged local production of goods, modernization of agricultural practices, and investment in infrastructure to facilitate trade and industry. Policies aimed to reduce dependency on imports, increase self-sufficiency, and create employment opportunities in urban and rural areas. Financial institutions, credit facilities, and cooperative programs supported these initiatives, providing resources for farmers, entrepreneurs, and local governments to participate in economic development. The Commonwealth era also advanced the legal and administrative framework for post-independence governance. Codification of laws, judicial reforms, and the establishment of regulatory institutions provided continuity from the American period while preparing for full sovereignty. Provincial and municipal governments were organized to enhance administrative efficiency, enforce legal standards, and provide services to local populations. Civil service examinations and training programs were implemented to ensure a professional and competent workforce capable of sustaining government operations beyond the transition period. Political, economic, and social developments during the Commonwealth period created the foundation for national identity and administrative capability. Citizens participated in governance, contributed to economic initiatives, and engaged with emerging national institutions. Educational and civic programs fostered a sense of responsibility, awareness of national issues, and capacity for public service. Infrastructure and institutional development facilitated communication, commerce, and administration across the archipelago, integrating regional economies and populations under centralized policy frameworks. By 1941, the Commonwealth had established functioning governance structures, a modernized education system, an expanding economy, and initial military preparedness, positioning the Philippines for eventual full independence. However, the outbreak of World War II and Japanese expansion in the Asia-Pacific region would interrupt this trajectory, introducing foreign occupation and military conflict that would redefine the political and social landscape. The Commonwealth period, nevertheless, represents a critical phase in the evolution of Philippine governance, demonstrating the implementation of constitutional democracy, economic modernization, and administrative preparation for sovereignty. The period from 1941 to 1945 represents a significant disruption in the political, social, and economic development of the Philippines, defined by the Japanese occupation during World War II. Following the expansion of Japanese forces in the Asia-Pacific region, the Philippines became a strategic target due to its geographical location, resources, and status as a U.S. territory. The occupation involved military conquest, establishment of a puppet government, economic exploitation, and the imposition of administrative and social control. The Japanese invasion commenced on December 8, 1941, one day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, as part of Japan's broader strategy to secure control of Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific. Japanese forces landed on multiple points across Luzon, including Apari and Lamon Bay, and began rapid territorial advances. The U.S. and Philippine Commonwealth forces, under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, implemented defensive strategies, including the withdrawal to the Bataan Peninsula and Corregidor Island to delay Japanese occupation. The strategic objective was to hold key defensive positions while awaiting reinforcements and establishing lines of supply. The fall of Manila occurred on January 2, 1942, after intense military engagement and bombardment. Japanese forces secured the capital and key urban centers, effectively controlling administrative, economic, and communication hubs. The occupation was characterized by centralized Japanese authority, imposition of military law, and suppression of civil liberties. Filipino military personnel and civilians faced imprisonment, forced labor, and relocation, while organized resistance began forming in both urban and rural areas. Following the occupation, the Japanese established the Second Philippine Republic under Jose P. Laurel in October 1943. This government operated under Japanese supervision, with limited authority in domestic administration. The administration implemented policies mandated by the occupying forces, including regulation of trade, rationing, propaganda dissemination, and enforcement of order. Laurel's government also sought to maintain social and administrative functions, attempting to mitigate disruptions to education, health, and local governance within the constraints imposed by military oversight. Economic exploitation was a significant aspect of the occupation. The Japanese military requisitioned food, raw materials, and manufactured goods to support the war effort, leading to shortages and inflation. Agricultural production was redirected toward Japanese military needs, and local industries were repurposed to support occupation logistics. Civilian populations faced rationing, currency devaluation, and labor obligations. The imposition of the Japanese military administration disrupted pre-war economic structures, contributing to famine, resource scarcity, and widespread hardship. During the occupation, resistance movements emerged throughout the archipelago. The Hikbalahap, Hukbong Bayan Laban Sa Hapon, in central Luzon represented organized armed resistance, conducting guerrilla operations against Japanese forces, targeting supply lines, and assisting civilian populations affected by occupation policies. In northern Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao, local guerrilla units operated independently or in coordination with American intelligence, maintaining communication with the exiled Commonwealth government and U.S. forces. These groups utilized knowledge of terrain, population support, and covert operations to disrupt Japanese administration and maintain Filipino agency under occupation. The exiled Philippine Commonwealth government, led by President Manuel L. Quezon until he died in 1944, continued to operate in coordination with the United States. The government maintained diplomatic relations, organized military planning for the liberation of the Philippines, and facilitated support for guerrilla operations within the archipelago. U.S. military forces, alongside Filipino and multinational units, planned the re-establishment of sovereignty and restoration of civil administration following the anticipated Allied counteroffensive. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, fought between the 23rd and the 26th of October 1944, marked the commencement of the Allied campaign to liberate the Philippines. General Douglas MacArthur led the amphibious landings on Leyte, fulfilling his pre-war promise to return. The battle involved coordinated naval, air, and ground operations, resulting in the near destruction of the Japanese fleet and providing a strategic foothold for subsequent operations in Luzon and other regions. Allied forces secured beachheads, enabling the resupply of troops, reinforcement of guerrilla units, and a systematic campaign to liberate occupied territories. The liberation of Manila and the surrounding provinces occurred in early 1945. Manila was liberated on March 3, 1945, after intense urban combat. The city had suffered significant destruction due to Japanese defensive operations, artillery bombardment, and urban warfare. Civilian populations experienced widespread casualties and displacement. Following the recapture of Manila, Allied forces continued operations to secure remaining Japanese positions in Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao. The campaign concluded in August 1945 with the unconditional surrender of Japanese forces in the Philippines, coinciding with the broader conclusion of World War II following the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Japanese occupation introduced profound structural, social, and political disruptions. Education systems were reorganized to include Japanese language and propaganda. Civil administration was subordinated to military authority, limiting Filipino participation in governance. Public services, trade networks, and industrial activity were heavily regulated or repurposed to support the Japanese war effort. Population movements, labor conscription, and requisitioning imposed widespread challenges on civilian populations, including famine, disease, and social dislocation. Resistance networks and the re-establishment of Allied and Commonwealth authority demonstrated the resilience of Filipino governance structures and social organization. Guerrilla units and local administrators maintained forms of civil oversight, provided basic services, and safeguarded communities under occupation. Coordination with exiled government authorities and U.S. intelligence allowed for strategic planning and continuity of national aspirations, despite the absence of full sovereignty and the pervasive influence of occupying forces. The occupation also exposed the vulnerability of the archipelago to external military aggression, highlighting the importance of strategic geographic control, defense preparedness, and coordination between civil and military institutions. Post-war Reconstruction priorities would include restoration of governance, rebuilding of infrastructure, re-establishment of the economy, and integration of military and civil planning into national defense. The experience of occupation influenced subsequent policies regarding military readiness, international alliances, and domestic administration. The period from 1946 to 1965 represents the establishment of the Philippines as an independent republic and the subsequent post-war reconstruction and nation-building under successive administrations. Following the end of World War II and the conclusion of Japanese occupation, the Philippines faced the challenge of reconstructing a war-torn economy, restoring political institutions, and integrating social, economic, and political reforms to ensure stability and governance. The United States officially recognized Philippine independence on July 4, 1946, ending nearly 4 decades of American sovereignty and transitioning the archipelago to full national control. Manuel Roxas was inaugurated as the first president of the independent Third Republic of the Philippines. The inauguration marked the assumption of sovereignty in legislative, executive, and judicial functions while maintaining diplomatic and economic ties with the United States. Key issues at this stage included rehabilitation of infrastructure, reestablishment of governance, and stabilization of the economy devastated by war and occupation. Roxas administration, 1946 to 1948, prioritized reconstruction and recovery. The government implemented programs to rebuild roads, bridges, schools, and hospitals destroyed during the Japanese occupation. The administration negotiated agreements with the United States, including the Bell Trade Act, which established trade and economic frameworks favoring U.S. access to Philippine markets and currency stabilization. Roxas also addressed internal security challenges, particularly the threat posed by the Hikbalahap Hook insurgency, a residual leftist guerrilla movement originating from anti-Japanese resistance, which had evolved into a domestic armed challenge against government authority. Military campaigns, civic action programs, and negotiations were employed to reduce insurgent activity while restoring local governance. Following Roxas, Elpidio Carina served as president from 1948 to 1953. Quirino continued the post-war Reconstruction, expanding infrastructure projects, modernizing administrative institutions, and addressing social and economic needs. Quirino implemented policies to stabilize the currency, encourage industrialization, and promote agricultural recovery. Programs such as land reform initiatives were introduced to redistribute idle and underutilized agricultural lands to tenant farmers. Although these policies faced practical challenges and limitations in execution, Quirino also maintained security measures to suppress the Hook Rebellion, combining military operations with social development programs aimed at reducing local support for insurgents. Ramon Magsaysay, elected in 1953 and serving until 1957, focused on both security and social reform. Magsaysay is credited with professionalizing the military and police forces, introducing merit-based recruitment, and improving operational efficiency in counterinsurgency campaigns against the Hook movement. Social programs included land reform initiatives, rural development projects, and the expansion of public services to underserved provinces. Magsaysay's policies emphasized the integration of civil and military administration to strengthen governance and reduce the appeal of insurgent movements. His administration also promoted infrastructure development, including the construction of roads, bridges, and public buildings to support economic growth and connectivity. Following Magsaysay, Carlos P. Garcia served as president from 1957 to 1961, maintaining continuity in economic and political policies while pursuing initiatives in foreign relations and national economic independence. Garcia's administration emphasized the Filipino First policy, which prioritized domestic industries and encouraged Filipino ownership and control of key sectors of the economy. Efforts were made to regulate foreign investments, promote local production, and increase participation of Filipino entrepreneurs in commerce, banking, and industry. Garcia also pursued fiscal policies to stabilize the economy, reduce inflationary pressures, and improve government revenues. During this period, economic reconstruction continued across multiple sectors. Agricultural production was revitalized through modernization programs, irrigation expansion, and the introduction of new crop varieties. Urban areas experienced commercial growth, with the expansion of trade networks, retail industries, and services. Banking and financial institutions were strengthened to facilitate credit, investment, and savings. Industrial development, although limited compared to agriculture, included the establishment of small and medium enterprises producing consumer goods and light manufacturing. Trade agreements, both regional and international, were negotiated to facilitate exports and access to foreign markets, reflecting the Philippines' integration into the global economy. Infrastructure rehabilitation remained a priority. Ports, airports, and transportation networks were rebuilt to support trade, mobility, and communication. Public utilities, including electricity, water supply, and telecommunications, were expanded to urban and selected rural areas. Housing programs and urban planning initiatives addressed population growth, post-war displacement, and migration to cities, ensuring that social infrastructure supported the demands of reconstruction and economic growth. Social policy initiatives focused on education, health, and welfare. Public education systems, previously disrupted during the war, were restored and expanded, providing primary, secondary, and higher education opportunities. Teacher training, curriculum standardization, and school construction were prioritized to enhance literacy and human capital development. Public health programs addressed endemic diseases, promoted vaccination, and improved hospital and clinic access. Welfare programs targeted vulnerable populations, including war widows, orphans, and displaced communities, aiming to restore social stability and integrate affected groups into productive economic activity. Internal security and political stability were maintained through the integration of the military, police, and civil administration. Counterinsurgency operations against the Hook Rebellion were conducted in coordination with social and economic development programs to reduce support for armed opposition. The government established regional administrative offices to ensure governance, monitor compliance with national policies, and provide a mechanism for dispute resolution at the provincial and municipal levels. The integration of civil and security functions reflected a strategy to consolidate state authority, maintain order, and enable long-term development. Foreign relations were defined by continued cooperation with the United States, participation in international organizations, and engagement in regional diplomacy. The Philippines became a founding member of the United Nations in 1945 and engaged in early post-war regional discussions regarding security, trade, and economic development. Diplomatic relations with neighboring Asian nations and participation in multilateral forums supported the Reconstruction effort, facilitated access to technical expertise, and promoted international recognition of the independent republic. By 1965, the Philippines had established functioning governance structures, rebuilt infrastructure and public services, restored agricultural and economic production, and addressed internal security challenges. The post-war administrations of Roxas, Quirino, Magsaysay, and Garcia provided continuity in policy implementation, combined reconstruction with institution building, and advanced economic and social development. Political institutions, including the presidency, legislature, judiciary, and local governments, were operational and integrated into national administration, reflecting the consolidation of sovereignty and administrative capability. This period laid the foundation for subsequent economic growth, political development, and social modernization, demonstrating the capacity of the Philippines to recover from wartime devastation and establish the framework for continued national development, democratic governance, and integration into international economic and diplomatic systems. The period from 1965 to 1986 covers the administration of Ferdinand E. Marcos, the declaration of martial law, economic and social policies, political consolidation, and the events leading to the EDSA People Power Revolution. This era represents a complex phase in Philippine history, marked by authoritarian rule, centralized governance, economic developments, internal security operations, and eventual mass political mobilization. Ferdinand Marcos was elected president in 1965 and re-elected in 1969, becoming the first Philippine president to secure a second term. His administration initially emphasized infrastructure development, agricultural modernization, and public investment programs aimed at stimulating economic growth. Large-scale projects included the construction of roads, bridges, government buildings, and energy infrastructure. Economic policies encouraged industrialization, expansion of export-oriented industries, and foreign investment. Marcos's administration also promoted public housing, urban development, and initiatives to improve access to education and health services. Despite initial development programs, political challenges emerged. Allegations of corruption, electoral manipulation, and favoritism intensified opposition from political parties, civic groups, and the media. The political environment was increasingly polarized, with growing dissent in universities, labor unions, and regional communities. These pressures, combined with social unrest and perceived threats from communist and separatist movements, were cited by Marcos as justification for extraordinary measures to maintain national stability. On September 21, 1972, Marcos declared martial law under Proclamation No. 1081, citing threats from communist insurgency, Muslim separatist movements in Mindanao, and social disorder. Martial law granted the president extensive powers to control the legislative, executive, and judicial branches, enforce curfews, suspend civil liberties, and regulate the media. Opposition leaders, journalists, activists, and political rivals were arrested or detained without formal charges. The imposition of authoritarian rule centralized political power, limited public dissent, and restructured government operations under executive supervision. During martial law, Marcos pursued economic and infrastructure programs, often characterized by large-scale projects and foreign borrowing. Industrialization policies sought to expand manufacturing, energy production, and urban infrastructure. Government investment was directed toward highways, bridges, ports, and hydroelectric projects. Urban planning in Manila and other metropolitan areas focused on modernization, public transportation systems, and housing programs. Agricultural programs, while present, faced criticism for uneven distribution of resources and limited support to smallholder farmers. Marcos's government established a new constitution in 1973, which replaced the presidential system with a parliamentary-style structure, consolidating executive authority and allowing extended terms. Legislative powers were exercised by the Batasang Pambansa, which functioned under executive oversight. Political parties were reorganized to facilitate alignment with the administration, limiting effective opposition. These structural changes reinforced centralized governance and extended the political control of the Marcos administration. Internal security operations during this period targeted insurgent groups, particularly the Communist Party of the Philippines, CPP, and its armed wing, the New People's Army, NPA. The government implemented counterinsurgency campaigns that included military, police, and intelligence operations. Simultaneously, the administration addressed separatist movements in Mindanao, including the Moro National Liberation Front, MNLF, through a combination of military engagement, negotiation, and localized development initiatives. These security measures reflected the administration's objective to maintain control over territorial integrity and suppress organized opposition. The assassination of opposition leader Benigno Ninoy Aquino Jr. on August 21, 1983, upon his return from exile, marked a turning point in political dissent. Aquino's death galvanized public opinion against the Marcos administration, intensifying protests, mobilizing political parties, and expanding opposition coalitions. Civic organizations, religious groups, labor unions, and student movements coalesced to demand accountability, democratic governance, and restoration of civil liberties. The incident highlighted the fragility of authoritarian rule and the capacity for mass mobilization in response to perceived injustice. Economic conditions during the later years of the Marcos administration deteriorated, exacerbated by high foreign debt, global economic fluctuations, and domestic mismanagement. While the early years of industrialization and infrastructure investment had shown growth, fiscal deficits, corruption, and cronyism reduced efficiency and contributed to declining public trust. Inflation, unemployment, and social inequality became more pronounced, creating widespread dissatisfaction and increasing pressure for political change. Political mobilization intensified following the 1986 presidential election, in which Ferdinand Marcos claimed victory amid allegations of widespread electoral fraud. The contested election triggered protests, civil disobedience, and calls for mass demonstrations. Key military leaders, disillusioned with the administration, coordinated with opposition leaders, the Catholic Church, and civil society to organize a unified response. The culmination of these factors was the EDSA People Power Revolution, which occurred from 22 to February 25, 1986. Millions of citizens participated in peaceful demonstrations along Epifanio de los Santos Avenue, EDSA, in Metro Manila, demanding the resignation of Marcos and the restoration of democratic governance. Military and police units withdrew support from the administration, facilitating the transition. The revolution was marked by the absence of armed conflict between opposing forces and relied on civilian mobilization, communication networks, and negotiation to achieve political change. The result of the EDSA revolution was the end of Marcos's 21-year rule. Marcos and his family fled to the United States, and Corazon Aquino, widow of Benigno Aquino Jr., assumed the presidency. The revolution restored democratic institutions, repealed martial law provisions, and established mechanisms for constitutional governance. Civil liberties, electoral participation, and the independence of the judiciary were reinstated. The events of this period highlighted the limits of authoritarian control, the effectiveness of nonviolent mass action, and the resilience of democratic institutions in the Philippines. The Marcos era, including the period of martial law and the lead-up to EDSA, had lasting implications for governance, political institutions, and social dynamics. Centralization of authority, economic development policies, and infrastructure programs were counterbalanced by political repression, corruption, and social inequality. The consolidation of opposition movements, mobilization of civil society, and eventual restoration of democratic governance demonstrated the capacity for institutional recovery and the role of public participation in shaping political outcomes. The period from 1986 to 2016 in the Philippines was defined by the restoration of democratic governance, consolidation of political institutions, economic modernization, and social reforms following the end of the Marcos era. The transition marked the re-establishment of constitutional democracy and the adaptation of state structures to support governance, development, and civil liberties under successive administrations. Corazon Aquino assumed the presidency in 1986 following the EDSA People Power Revolution, ending 21 years of authoritarian rule. Aquino's administration focused on restoring democratic institutions, ratifying a new constitution, and re-establishing the rule of law. The 1987 Constitution of the Republic of the Philippines reinstated a presidential system of government, separation of powers among the executive, legislative, and judicial branches, and provisions for civil liberties, human rights, and checks on executive authority. Electoral processes, local governance, and judicial independence were reinforced to prevent the concentration of power seen during the previous regime. The Aquino administration faced multiple internal challenges. Coup attempts by factions of the military and residual political forces loyal to the Marcos era occurred between 1986 and 1989, requiring a combination of military, political, and diplomatic measures to maintain stability. Simultaneously, the government addressed the New People's Army (NPA) insurgency and ongoing conflicts in Mindanao with Moro separatist groups. Peace negotiations, localized development programs, and military operations were employed to reduce armed conflict while attempting to integrate affected regions into national administration. Following Aquino, Fidel Ramos served as president from 1992 to 1998, emphasizing economic liberalization, infrastructure development, and institutional modernization. Ramos' administration implemented policies to attract foreign investment, reduce bureaucratic barriers, and expand private sector participation in industry and services. Regional development initiatives sought to decentralize administrative authority, improve local governance, and expand access to education, healthcare, and public services. Programs supporting human capital development, including vocational training and scholarships, were implemented to strengthen workforce capability. Ramos also played a role in international diplomacy, supporting regional cooperation and participation in multilateral economic and security arrangements. Joseph Estrada assumed the presidency in 1998 and served until 2001, focusing on social programs, anti-poverty initiatives, and the expansion of public services. Estrada's administration implemented economic recovery measures following the Asian financial crisis, including fiscal stimulus, targeted infrastructure investment, and support for small and medium enterprises. However, allegations of corruption and misuse of public funds emerged, culminating in widespread public protests and his removal from office through EDSA 2 in January 2001. Vice President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo assumed the presidency and continued governance while addressing political and economic challenges. Gloria Macapagal Arroyo's administration, 2001 to 2010, emphasized economic growth, infrastructure expansion, and modernization programs. Economic reforms included fiscal management, liberalization of trade policies, and promotion of export-oriented industries. Infrastructure projects, including transportation, energy, and telecommunications development, supported both urban and regional connectivity. Social programs targeted education, health, and poverty reduction, while public-private partnerships were employed to accelerate service delivery and development initiatives. Arroyo's administration also faced political challenges, including allegations of electoral fraud and corruption, requiring management of governance credibility alongside economic and development objectives. Benigno Aquino III, serving from 2010 to 2016, focused on governance reforms, transparency, and institutional efficiency. The administration pursued anti-corruption measures, public sector modernization, and fiscal responsibility to strengthen state capacity. Aquino emphasized digital development, information technology integration and governance, and programs to improve public service delivery. Key initiatives included infrastructure expansion under the Build program, improvements in transportation networks, and modernization of ports, airports, and public facilities. During Aquino's presidency, international relations were a central policy area, particularly regarding territorial disputes in the West Philippine Sea. The administration sought resolution through legal arbitration under international law, particularly the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS. The 2016 Arbitral Tribunal ruling clarified the Philippines' maritime entitlements and sovereignty claims, influencing regional diplomacy and defense strategy. Elections, legislative processes, judicial independence, and local governance mechanisms functioned as pillars for continuity and accountability. Political transitions, including the peaceful transfer of power, reinforced institutional stability and democratic legitimacy. Economic development during this era focused on industrialization, services, foreign investment, and infrastructure modernization. Urban centers, particularly Metro Manila, Cebu, and Davao, expanded commercially, while regional development programs sought to reduce disparities between urban and rural areas. Agricultural modernization, support for small and medium enterprises, and promotion of export-oriented production contributed to economic diversification. Banking, finance, and telecommunications sectors were strengthened to facilitate growth, investment, and integration into global markets. Social reforms aimed to improve public education, healthcare, and poverty reduction. Public education systems expanded to include universal basic education, secondary schooling, and vocational training, emphasizing skills development and literacy. Health programs targeted maternal and child welfare, communicable disease control, and expansion of hospitals and clinics. Poverty reduction initiatives included social protection programs, conditional cash transfers, and targeted support for marginalized communities. These measures were intended to strengthen human capital and enhance the capacity of citizens to participate in economic and political life. Internal security operations continued to address insurgent groups, separatist movements, and criminal networks. Counterinsurgency campaigns, peace negotiations, and development-oriented programs were employed to reduce conflict and integrate affected communities into governance and economic activity. The government emphasized coordination between national and local authorities to maintain territorial integrity, provide public services, and enforce law and order. International engagement expanded through trade agreements, regional cooperation, and participation in multilateral organizations. The Philippines maintained active membership in ASEAN, the United Nations, and other international bodies, negotiating trade, investment, and diplomatic initiatives. Policies promoted regional integration, security cooperation, and economic partnership, reflecting the country's role as a middle-income nation with global and regional responsibilities. By 2016, the Philippines had re-established functioning democratic governance, institutional stability, and economic modernization after 3 decades of political transition. Governance reforms, infrastructure expansion, social programs, and international engagement position the country for further economic growth, social development, and political consolidation. Democratic processes, electoral participation, and rule of law remain central to governance, while economic and social initiatives aim to address long-term development objectives and integrate the Philippines into regional and global systems. The period from 2016 to 2025 encompasses contemporary developments in the Philippines, characterized by governance under successive administrations, responses to domestic and global challenges, economic and infrastructure initiatives, public health crises, and regional and international diplomacy. This era demonstrates the continued evolution of the Philippine state within democratic institutions and global frameworks, emphasizing modernization, political continuity, and socioeconomic resilience. Rodrigo Duterte assumed the presidency on June 30th, 2016, following the national elections that reflected widespread public demand for policy reforms and security-focused governance. Duterte's administration prioritized anti-drug campaigns, criminal justice initiatives, and law enforcement reforms. The government implemented the Oplan Tokang and related programs aimed at reducing illegal drug activities and organized crime. These measures were accompanied by the expansion of local and national policing capacity, modernization of law enforcement agencies, and integration of intelligence systems to monitor and respond to criminal networks. Infrastructure development was central to Duterte's policy agenda. The administration launched the Build program, emphasizing large-scale infrastructure projects including roads, bridges, airports, seaports, and public transit systems. These projects aim to improve connectivity, facilitate trade, enhance mobility, and stimulate economic activity. Funding was sourced from public-private partnerships, government appropriations, and international loans, reflecting a strategic approach to national development. Urban and regional development plans incorporated modernization of transportation networks, port facilities, and energy infrastructure, enhancing both economic and logistical capacity. Economic policies during this period focused on sustaining growth, expanding public investment, and promoting digital transformation. Efforts were made to attract foreign direct investment, expand industrial production, and support micro, small, and medium enterprises. Agricultural modernization continued with programs targeting productivity, irrigation, and supply chain efficiency. The administration promoted fiscal discipline, tax reform initiatives, and measures to increase government revenue while balancing social and infrastructure expenditure. The Philippines experienced economic resilience despite global uncertainties, regional competition, and domestic fiscal challenges. In 2020, the Philippines confronted the COVID-19 pandemic, which significantly affected public health, the economy, and daily life. The government implemented a series of health and containment measures, including lockdowns, social distancing policies, mass testing programs, quarantine protocols, and vaccination campaigns. Economic relief packages were introduced to support individuals, households, and businesses affected by disruptions in production, trade, and employment. Health infrastructure expansion, procurement of medical equipment, and coordination with local and international agencies formed the basis of the national pandemic response. The pandemic accelerated digital adoption in governance, education, and commerce, demonstrating the capacity of the state and society to adapt to large-scale disruptions. In foreign policy, Duterte pursued an independent and pragmatic approach, emphasizing diversified international relations while maintaining traditional alliances. Engagement with China, the United States, and ASEAN member states reflected a balance between regional diplomacy, economic cooperation, and security considerations. Infrastructure projects and investment agreements were negotiated with multiple international partners, advancing economic development and connectivity. Defense and security policy continued to emphasize territorial integrity, maritime sovereignty, and cooperation with allied nations in addressing regional challenges. The 2022 presidential election resulted in the election of Ferdinand Marcos Jr., who assumed office on June 30th, 2022. This marked a return of the Marcos political legacy to the presidency. Marcos Jr.'s administration emphasized continuity in economic policy, infrastructure development, and public service modernization. Government priorities included maintaining fiscal stability, expanding digital infrastructure, supporting trade and investment, and enhancing disaster preparedness and climate resilience. Policy initiatives were coordinated with local governments, regional agencies, and international development partners to strengthen economic and administrative capacity across provinces and metropolitan areas. Social policy during this period emphasized public health, education, poverty reduction, and digital governance. Programs aimed to expand access to healthcare services, improve educational infrastructure, and provide support for vulnerable populations. Technology adoption and governance, public service delivery, and information dissemination increased efficiency and accessibility. Disaster management and climate adaptation programs addressed the Philippines' vulnerability to natural hazards, including typhoons, earthquakes, and floods, reflecting a long-term strategy for resilience and sustainable development. Economic development from 2016 to 2025 focused on regional growth, industry diversification, and integration into global supply chains. The government promoted export-oriented industries, supported micro and small enterprises, and invested in technology and innovation. Urban development projects targeted congestion reduction, transportation efficiency, and public service accessibility. The expansion of ports, airports, and logistics networks enhanced trade capacity, while energy infrastructure improvements aim to ensure reliability and sustainability. Economic growth was accompanied by regulatory reform initiatives, investment facilitation measures, and targeted fiscal policies to encourage private sector participation. Domestic governance during this period was characterized by democratic continuity, regular electoral processes, and institutional oversight. Legislative, judicial, and executive functions operated under the 1987 Constitution, maintaining separation of powers and accountability mechanisms. Local government units executed regional development programs, enforced national policies, and coordinated with central government agencies to ensure compliance and service delivery. Civil society organizations, media, and citizen engagement continued to play a role in policy monitoring, public accountability, and participatory governance. The Philippines remained an active participant in ASEAN and international organizations, contributing to regional security, economic integration, and cooperative initiatives. Trade agreements, diplomatic dialogues, and multilateral engagement facilitated economic cooperation, conflict resolution, and participation in global development programs. The administration pursued strategic diplomacy to protect territorial sovereignty, enhance trade opportunities, and maintain international partnerships in economic, environmental, and security matters. By October 28, 2025, the Philippines will continue to navigate post-pandemic recovery, economic modernization, and social development. Infrastructure programs, digital transformation, and regional development projects remain central to national policy. Governance maintains democratic structures while addressing emerging challenges, including climate adaptation, global economic fluctuations, and public service modernization. The period illustrates the adaptation of political, economic, and social institutions to contemporary conditions while maintaining continuity within the constitutional democratic framework. The history of the Philippines, spanning from the Laguna Copperplate Inscription in AD 900 to the contemporary republic in 2025, reflects a continuous process of political evolution, social adaptation, and cultural integration. Across more than a millennium, the archipelago has undergone successive phases of pre-colonial development, colonial subjugation, revolutionary struggle, nation-building, and modern statehood. This extended historical trajectory demonstrates the persistence of governance structures, societal organization, and cultural identity, even under external influence and internal transformation. The initial recorded history, beginning with the Laguna Copperplate inscription on April 21 AD 900, establishes evidence of organized polities, codified law, literacy, and regional interaction within Southeast Asia. Local leaders, known as datas, governed barangays that engaged in trade and diplomatic relations with neighboring polities in Java, Srivijaya, and the Malay Peninsula. The archipelago's early society exhibited hierarchical governance, social stratification, and legal institutions, indicating a complex socio-political organization. Trade networks facilitated the movement of goods such as ceramics, metals, beads, and textiles, while cultural and religious ideas, including Hindu-Buddhist elements and, later, Islam, influenced local belief systems and social structures. Pre-colonial polities persisted and evolved until the arrival of European powers in the 16th century. Barangay communities, sultanates in the south, and regional maritime centers such as Tonda, Butuan, Cebu, and Sulu maintained economic and diplomatic engagement across the archipelago and beyond. The spread of Islam in Mindanao and Sulu established enduring political and religious institutions integrated into regional networks, influencing governance, law, and trade. Simultaneously, local animist and Hindu-Buddhist practices coexisted alongside these new systems, creating a syncretic cultural and religious landscape. Spanish colonization, beginning with Magellan's arrival in 1521 and consolidated under Legazpi in 1565, introduced a centralized colonial administration, Catholicism, and global trade integration through the Manila, Acapulco Galleon Trade. Spanish authority gradually extended over the majority of the islands, excluding certain highland and southern regions, creating a political structure combining colonial governance, missionary influence, and indigenous administrative practices. Catholicism became a defining feature of Philippine society, shaping social norms, education, and governance, while resistance by Muslim sultanates and highland communities persisted. The 19th century introduced ideas of reform, nationalism, and resistance. Reformist movements emerged through the propaganda movement and writings of José Rizal, Marcelo del Pilar, and Graciano López Gina, advocating for representation, legal reform, and civil liberties under Spanish colonial rule. The Philippine Revolution of 1896, led by the Katipunan, and the subsequent Declaration of Independence in 1898, marked the assertion of Filipino political agency. Although the First Philippine Republic was short-lived due to the Philippine-American War, the establishment of national institutions and codified governance structures demonstrated the continuity of state-building efforts. American colonial rule from 1902 to 1935 implemented civil governance, public education, infrastructure expansion, and political reforms that institutionalized democratic practices and introduced economic modernization. The Commonwealth Era, 1935 to 1941, prepared the Philippines for independence, emphasizing social reform, defense preparedness, and administrative capacity. The Japanese occupation, 1941 to 1945, temporarily disrupted governance and economic systems. But post-war Reconstruction facilitated the emergence of the independent Third Republic in 1946. Successive administrations during this period focused on rebuilding infrastructure, stabilizing the economy, addressing insurgency, and consolidating democratic institutions. The post-war period demonstrated the interplay between political authority, social development, and economic growth. Presidents from Manuel Roxas to Carlos P. Garcia implemented programs to rehabilitate the country, modernize agriculture and industry, and integrate national institutions. Internal security challenges, including the Hagbalahap insurgency, were addressed through military operations combined with social and economic reforms to reduce insurgent support. Diplomatic relations, primarily with the United States and regional neighbors, positioned the Philippines as a sovereign, internationally recognized state capable of participating in global and regional systems. The EDSA People Power Revolution, 1986, restored democracy, emphasizing the role of civil society, institutional resilience, and mass political mobilization in shaping governance. The subsequent democratic restoration and modernization period, 1986 to 2016, consolidated democratic institutions, expanded economic and infrastructure programs, and strengthened social services. Successive administrations, from Corazon Aquino to Benigno Aquino III, reinforced constitutional governance, implemented fiscal and economic reforms, modernized infrastructure, promoted public health and education, and engaged in regional and international diplomacy. Policies addressed insurgency, separatist movements, and social inequality while facilitating integration into global trade and political systems. From 2016 to 2025, the Philippines navigated contemporary challenges, including public health crises, technological modernization, infrastructure expansion, economic growth, and regional diplomacy. The Duterte administration implemented law enforcement and anti-drug campaigns while advancing infrastructure and economic programs. The COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 significantly impacted health systems, the economy, and social activity, prompting government responses including lockdowns, vaccination programs, and economic relief measures. The Marcos Jr. administration, beginning in 2022, focused on policy continuity, modernization, infrastructure, and digital transformation, ensuring adaptation to contemporary domestic and international conditions. Throughout this millennium-long trajectory, the Philippines has demonstrated institutional continuity and adaptability. Governance structures evolved from barangay leadership and sultanate administration to colonial frameworks, revolutionary republics, and modern democratic institutions. Legal systems, administrative practices, and political mechanisms adapted to changing internal and external circumstances, while civil society and local governance maintained continuity in social and civic organization. Economic systems transitioned from pre-colonial trade networks to colonial and post-colonial integration into global markets, reflecting both continuity in commerce and adaptation to global economic dynamics. Cultural and social identity remained a central feature of continuity. social norms, family structures, and community organization preserve continuity across periods of political and economic change. The contemporary state reflects accumulated historical experience, combining sovereignty, constitutional governance, economic modernization, and social development. Infrastructure, public services, education, health systems, and institutional frameworks embody centuries of adaptation and evolution. International engagement, regional cooperation, and participation in global institutions illustrate the integration of historical experience into contemporary governance and policymaking. By 2025, the Philippines will exemplify a nation that has evolved through cycles of external influence, internal adaptation, political reform, economic development, and social integration. The archipelago's history, spanning over a millennium, demonstrates the capacity of institutions, society, and governance structures to sustain continuity while responding to change. Political resilience, social cohesion, and economic adaptation underpin the ongoing development of the modern democratic state.